She blocked the evacuation bus. I called the National Guard and took back control right in front of her. The yellow school bus sat at the iron gate, engine running, 23 terrified children pressed against the windows, and Margaret Holloway stood in the middle of the road with her arms crossed, refusing to move. "This is private HOA property," she said. "No vehicle enters without my written approval." I could see smoke rising from the ridge 2 miles east. The evacuation order had been in effect for 40 minutes. My daughter Maya was on that bus. The driver was begging. Margaret smiled like she just won something, and I felt a rage in my chest I had never felt before in my life. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number most people in this neighborhood didn't know I had. 40 minutes later, 2 National Guard vehicles rolled down Sycamore Lane. Margaret's smile disappeared for the first time in 3 years. It was only the beginning. My name is Claire Nguyen. I'm 38, a licensed civil engineer, and I moved to Pinecrest Estates in Riverside County with my husband Daniel and our daughter Maya 6 years ago. We chose this neighborhood because of the good schools, the hiking trails, and what the realtor called a tight-knit community. She was not entirely wrong. Daniel teaches high school history 2 towns over. Maya is 9. She collects rocks, talks to every dog she meets, and once spent an entire Saturday teaching our neighbor's elderly father how to use video chat. I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for us. I am telling you this so you understand what was at stake. I worked long hours, coached Maya's soccer team on weekends, and served on the HOA's landscaping subcommittee for 2 years before I realized the whole organization was a vehicle for one person's control. By the time I understood that fully, it was almost too late. Margaret Holloway had been HOA president of Pinecrest Estates for 11 years. She was 61, retired from a career in insurance underwriting, widowed, and had no children. She had white blonde hair she kept in a precise chin-length bob and drove a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade with a custom HOA president placard on the dashboard. She ran every HOA meeting like a courtroom where she was simultaneously judge, prosecutor, and the only witness who mattered. She interrupted residents, dismissed motions before they were finished, and had a way of smiling that made your skin feel cold. Board members who disagreed with her had a habit of quietly resigning within a few months. The first time I met her, she shook my hand at a neighborhood welcome party, looked me up and down once, and said, "We have very specific standards here. I'm sure you'll adapt." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. It was not a joke. I would not understand that for another 3 weeks. The HOA bylaws at Pinecrest were 62 pages long. Margaret had been the primary author of the last revision in 2019. She knew every clause, every loophole, and every ambiguity, and she used them the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. Precisely, without hesitation, and always in her favor. Our first violation notice arrived 8 weeks after we moved in. It cited unapproved exterior paint color on our mailbox post. The post was the same beige that the builder had used. We had changed nothing. Margaret's assistant, a nervous young man named Todd, slipped it under our door at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. Daniel thought we should just repaint and move on. I requested a formal hearing. Margaret granted it, showed up with a laminated color chart, declared our beige off-spec by 3 shades, and fined us $75. When I asked to see the original builder's documentation, she said those records were not available to general residents. I noted the phrase, general residents. I began keeping a folder. Every notice, every email, every meeting minute. Not because I was planning anything, just because something in my engineer's brain recognized a system operating outside its stated parameters, and I needed to document it. That folder would eventually be 91 pages long. Over the next 2 years, I watched Margaret use the HOA like a feudal estate. She approved fence variances for people who brought her wine at Christmas. She denied identical requests from the Patels on Cedar Court, citing aesthetic inconsistency, which was not a real violation category anywhere in the bylaws. The Patels were the only South Asian family on their block. She once fined a single mother named Rosa Delgado $300 because Rosa's teenager had parked a motorcycle in the driveway for 2 hours on a Tuesday. Rosa worked nights at a hospital 30 miles away. She did not have money for $300. Margaret allowed her to pay in installments. I attended every board meeting after that. I sat in the front row and took notes. Margaret began addressing me directly during the open comment period, usually with something like, "Ms. Nguyen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the board has already considered this matter." She had not. I had the minutes to prove it. The neighborhood's emergency access roads were something I'd flagged in a subcommittee report 18 months before the fire season I'm telling you about. The eastern service gate, the one that connected Sycamore Lane to the county fire road, was padlocked. The key was held exclusively by Margaret. I had put it in writing that this was a safety risk. She tabled the discussion permanently. 3 families had moved out of Pinecrest in the 2 years before I started paying attention. I reached out to one of them, a couple named the Garcias, after I found their forwarding address in an old directory. Teresa Garcia told me, voice flat and tired. She made our life a lawsuit until we left. We didn't have the energy. I wrote that down too. What I didn't know, not yet, was that Margaret Holloway had been quietly buying up properties in the neighborhood through a shell LLC whenever a family sold in distress. She had been the one who made them distressed. By the time the fire season came, she owned 4 homes on our street besides her own. That was the twist I hadn't seen yet. The summer before everything happened, a wildfire research group at UC Riverside released a report identifying Pinecrest Estates as a critical egress bottleneck in the event of a fast-moving fire. The report specifically named the Eastern Service Gate. Margaret sent a letter to all residents dismissing the report as alarmist and academically irresponsible. I saved the letter. I sent a copy of the UC Riverside report to the Riverside County Fire Department. I sent another to our county supervisor's office. I got polite acknowledgments and no action. Later I would understand that Margaret had already called both offices and characterized me, by name, as a disruptive resident with a personal vendetta against HOA leadership. I did not know that then. Daniel told me I was spending too much energy on this. He wasn't wrong exactly, but I had grown up in a family that had lost a small business to a landlord who knew the rules and weaponized them against people who didn't. I recognized the shape of what Margaret was doing, and I could not unknow it. Maya asked me one evening why I was always at the dining table with papers spread out. I told her I was trying to make sure our neighborhood was safe. She thought about it and said, "Like a fire drill?" I said, "Yes, exactly like that." She nodded seriously and went back to her rocks. I should have listened to her more carefully. The fire season that year started early. By late June, Riverside County had already issued 3 red flag warnings. The ridge east of Pinecrest, covered in dry chaparral, had not burned in over 20 years. Fire behavior analysts called that fuel loading. I called the County Fire District non-emergency line and asked about evacuation protocols for our community. The dispatcher walked me through the official plan. The Eastern Service Gate was listed as a primary egress route. I printed that evacuation protocol. I brought it to the July HOA board meeting and asked Margaret, publicly on the record, to establish a secondary keyholder for the Eastern Gate in the event of emergency. She looked at me the way she always did, with that cold half-smile, and said, "Emergency access is a county matter, not an HOA matter. Your concern is noted." She moved on to Agenda Item 6, Acceptable Bird Feeder Dimensions. I filed a formal written request the next morning. Margaret's response, 3 days later, was a one-paragraph letter stating that the HOA board has sole authority over shared infrastructure, and that the issue had been thoroughly reviewed and requires no further action. She CC'd the community listserv. She knew what she was doing. She was making me look like a nuisance, not a concerned resident. What she didn't know, and this was my first small move, was that I had already contacted the Riverside County Office of Emergency Services directly, not to complain about Margaret, to ask a simple question. In a mandatory evacuation, does a private HOA have the legal authority to control access through a community gate on a county-mapped egress route? The answer I got back changed everything. But not yet. The week before the fire, Margaret sent out a community newsletter with a full-page feature on the new rose garden she'd had installed near the Sycamore Lane entrance. She thanked the board and all cooperative residents for their continued support of community standards. My name was not in the newsletter, though I had donated labor to the common area cleanup 3 weeks before. I had stopped being surprised by things like that. Rosa Delgado knocked on my door the Tuesday before the fire. She looked exhausted in the particular way she always did after a night shift. She told me Margaret had issued her a new violation. Her wind chimes were acoustically disruptive. There was no such category in the bylaws. I sat with Rosa at my kitchen table and helped her write a response citing chapter and verse. She cried a little quietly. I kept my voice steady. I was very good at keeping my voice steady by then. That Thursday evening, I got a call from my friend Denise, who lived 3 blocks over. She'd heard from Todd, Margaret's assistant, that Margaret was planning something for the fall HOA meeting. Something involving a bylaw amendment that would give the board president sole emergency authority over all community access points during declared local emergencies. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I called the County Office of Emergency Services back. The call to the county OES that Thursday night lasted 40 minutes. I spoke with a woman named Deputy Coordinator Sandra Reyes. I read her the proposed bylaw language. There was a pause on her end. She said, "Ms. Nguyen, I need you to email me the exact wording, because what you're describing would potentially conflict with California Government Code Section 8558. I sent it within the hour. Sandra called me back the next morning. She confirmed that the proposed bylaw would be unenforceable under state emergency law, and that it was also the kind of thing that could trigger a formal investigation of the HOA's compliance with county emergency access agreements. She was careful, professional, methodical. So was I. I asked her what, if anything, I should do. She told me to keep documenting. I drove to the county courthouse the following Monday and pulled the original HOA formation documents. Took 3 hours and cost me $14 in copy fees. What I found was interesting. The Eastern Gate was not actually HOA property. It was an easement, a county-recorded emergency access easement that predated the HOA's existence by 9 years. Margaret had been treating it as HOA infrastructure. Legally, it wasn't. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and read the easement document 3 times. Then I called Daniel. He listened and said, quietly, "Claire, be careful." I said I was always careful. He said, "That's what worries me." I understood what he meant. Margaret had resources. Margaret had connections. And I had just found something she didn't want found. I did not confront Margaret with this information immediately. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I sent copies to 3 places. Sandra Reyes at the county OES, our county supervisor's district office, and a real estate attorney named Phil Okafor, whose card I'd had in my folder for 8 months. Phil called me the next day. He said, "This is actually quite significant. Margaret's proposed bylaw amendment was on the agenda for the August HOA meeting." I had 2 weeks. I spent the first week quietly talking to neighbors, not campaigning, listening. I wanted to know who understood what was happening and who didn't. What I found was that most people were exhausted and afraid of Margaret, but several were angrier than I'd realized. The Delgados, the Patels, a retired firefighter named Earl Simmons on Birchwood Court. I kept a list. Earl Simmons was the detail that changed my understanding of the whole picture. He'd lived in Pinecrest for 22 years. He told me, over coffee at his kitchen table, that he had personally helped design the original Eastern Gate easement as part of a county fire safety initiative in 1998. He knew exactly what it was, and he told me that Margaret had approached him privately 4 years ago and offered to buy his house at a fair price. He had said no. His violations had started shortly after. I presented everything to Phil Okafor that Friday. He laid it out with the kind of precision I respected. The easement document, the proposed bylaw, the pattern of selective enforcement I documented over 3 years, Earl's account. He said we had enough to file for a temporary restraining order against the bylaw amendment if it passed. He also said something that stuck with me. She's been doing this a long time. She's very good at it. Don't move until you're ready. The night before the August HOA meeting, Margaret sent an email to all residents stating that she had received credible reports of an organized effort to destabilize community leadership and urging residents to stand with the board against outside interference. It was masterful in a terrible way. She was framing my research as aggression. Several neighbors who'd been sympathetic texted me nervously. I told them all the same thing. Come to the meeting and say nothing until I do. The August meeting was held in the Pinecrest Community Room at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. 41 residents attended, which was the highest turnout Margaret had seen in years. She knew why. She opened the meeting exactly as she always did, precise, composed, controlling the agenda. She introduced the bylaw amendment as a necessary clarification of board authority during crisis situations. She did not mention the easement. I raised my hand during the public comment period. Margaret looked at me and said, Ms. Nguyen, I want to remind you that public comment is limited to 2 minutes. I said, that's fine. I stood up, stated my name for the record, and placed 3 documents on the table. The county easement record, the OES correspondence, and a 1-paragraph letter from Phil Okafor stating that the proposed amendment would violate California government code. I said, I'd like these entered into the meeting minutes. Margaret's jaw tightened. She recovered quickly. I'll give her that. She said the documents were not verified and moved to proceed with the vote. Earl Simmons stood up before she could. He was 67 and built like a retired firefighter. He said, I was at the county meeting in 1998 when that easement was created. I know exactly what that gate is. And I know what you're trying to do, Margaret. The room went very quiet. Margaret called for order. 3 board members looked at each other. Todd, her assistant, was typing furiously on his laptop in the corner. The vote was postponed. Not defeated, just postponed, pending legal review. Margaret announced this in a tone that made it sound like her decision, her magnanimity. But I had watched her face when Earl spoke. Something had shifted behind her eyes. Not defeat, recalculation. After the meeting, as people filtered out, Margaret caught up with me in the parking lot. Just the 2 of us standing under a sodium light. She said pleasantly, I want you to know that I don't hold any of this against you personally, Claire. I know you mean well. I looked at her. I said, I know you know about the easement, Margaret. You've always known. She smiled and walked to her Escalade. She did not deny it. The legal review took 2 weeks. Margaret's HOA attorney, a man named Gerald Finch who had been billing the HOA for 6 years, issued a memo concluding that the proposed bylaw was legally sound with minor modifications. Phil reviewed the memo and sent me his notes in 3 pages. Every substantive claim in Finch's memo was either circular, unsupported, or wrong. Phil said quietly, "He's not writing law. He's writing cover." The fire started on a Tuesday in mid-August. 4:47 a.m. A lightning strike on the dry ridge east of Pinecrest, followed by 40-mile-an-hour winds. By 6:15, the Riverside County Fire Department had issued a mandatory evacuation order for all of Zone C, which included Pinecrest Estates and the elementary school half a mile from our eastern gate. I woke up to the smoke alarm and my phone screaming at the same time. Code red evacuation alert. I got Maya up, told her to grab her backpack and her rock collection. Daniel was already loading the car. I looked out our east-facing window and saw the ridge glowing orange in the pre-dawn dark. I called Sandra Reyes's emergency line. She picked up on the second ring. Sandra told me the county had dispatched school buses to the elementary school to evacuate the children whose parents hadn't yet arrived. The planned route was through the eastern service gate onto the county fire road, the fastest route away from the fire's projected path. She paused and said, "I need to make sure that gate is open." I said, "I'll call you back in 3 minutes." I knew even then what I was going to find. I drove to the eastern gate. It was 6:22 in the morning. The gate was padlocked. A yellow school bus was idling at the entrance, the driver leaning out the window. 23 children were visible in my headlights through the bus windows, some crying, some pressed against the glass looking at the orange sky. Standing in the middle of the road, arms crossed, was Margaret Holloway in a silk robe and slippers. I got out of my car. Margaret looked at me and said, "The evacuation route has not been approved through this gate. The primary county road is accessible via the northern exit." I said, "The northern exit adds 12 minutes and runs closer to the fire line. You know that." She said, "I'm following procedure." I looked at the bus driver. His name was Marcus. He looked at me like I was the last person on earth who could fix this. I pulled out my phone. I called Sandra Reyes. I said, "The eastern gate is blocked by the HOA president. She is physically preventing evacuation." Sandra's voice shifted from professional to operational in the space of one breath. She said, "I'm activating the county emergency protocol. Stay on scene." I said I would. Margaret said, "Who are you calling?" I said, "The people who own this gate." Margaret stepped toward me. She said, "You have no authority here. This is HOA property." I said, "No, Margaret, it's not. I have the easement documents in my car." She blinked. She said, "Whatever you think you found doesn't change the fact that I am the HOA president and I have the final say on access through this gate." I said, "In about 30 minutes, you're going to find out that's not true." She uncrossed her arms. I had never seen her uncertain before. It didn't last long. She took out her own phone and called Gerald Finch. At 6:28 in the morning, I stood 15 feet away and watched her walk back and forth explaining the situation. The bus driver, Marcus, got out of the bus and stood next to me. He was shaking. He said quietly, "I have 23 kids on that bus." I said, "I know. Don't move the bus." He said, "Where am I supposed to go?" I said, "Nowhere. Stay right here." The smoke was visible now from where we stood, a dark pillar rising over the ridge. I could hear the distant sound of a helicopter. Maya was in our car 300 meters back with Daniel. I had made them stay back. Margaret finished her call with Gerald Finch, straightened her robe, and turned to face me. She said, "My attorney confirms I am within my rights. If the county wants access, they need to file an emergency injunction." She had just quoted Gerald Finch. She actually believed him. I called Sandra back. I told her what Margaret had just said. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Sandra said, "Ms. Nguyen, I need you to step back from the gate and keep the area clear. We're reclassifying this as an obstructed emergency egress. The protocol that triggers is different. I said, how different? She said, significantly. I stepped back. Margaret watched me, suspicious of my calm. Sandra's team had already been in contact with the Riverside County Sheriff and the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. The reclassification Sandra had mentioned activated a specific provision of California emergency management law, one that authorizes state personnel to remove physical and human obstructions from county-recorded emergency access routes without a court order. I did not know this law by name at 6:40 in the morning. I know it very well now. Margaret apparently did not know it at all. She walked to the gate, touched the padlock as if reassuring herself it was still there, and turned to Marcus, the bus driver. She said, I suggest you use the northern exit. I won't be responsible for your delay. Marcus looked at the smoke behind her and said, Ma'am, I have children on this bus. She said, then drive. He did not move. I was very grateful to Marcus. 3 Pinecrest residents had gathered at a distance, watching. Rosa Delgado was among them. She had just come off her night shift and had stopped when she saw the bus. She stood next to me, still in her scrubs, and said nothing. She didn't need to. More residents were coming down Sycamore Lane on foot, drawn by the smoke and the sight of the bus. Margaret saw them and lifted her chin. She was performing now for an audience. This community has always followed its own procedures, Margaret announced, loud enough for the gathered residents to hear. I will not allow outside agencies to override the board's authority without proper legal process. That is not how this neighborhood operates. 2 residents nodded. 6 others looked at each other with expressions I recognized. Not agreement, calculation. They were deciding what it cost them to say something. Earl Simmons appeared at 6:47. He had driven his truck to the gate when he smelled the smoke. He parked behind my car and walked up with his arms at his sides, unhurried, the way retired firefighters move. He stood beside me and looked at the gate and looked at Margaret. He said, I've seen fires come down that ridge, Margaret. 12 minutes is the difference between a bad day and something you don't come back from. She said, Earl, stay out of this. He didn't. He walked to the gate and examined the lock. He turned to me. Standard HOA padlock. Do you have a number for the county fire marshal? I gave him Sandra Reyes's number. He called her directly, standing 10 feet from Margaret, and said, Earl Simmons, retired Riverside County Fire, 22 years. I'm at the Pinecrest Eastern Gate. I'm confirming the obstruction. What do you need from me? Sandra apparently told him. He nodded and said, Understood. We'll hold the line. Margaret stared at Earl for a moment. Then she said something I had never heard her say in 3 years of board meetings. You'll regret this. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and precise, and it was meant for both of us. Earl looked at her the way he might look at a brush fire that had just changed direction, with attention, not fear. At 6:55, the first county sheriff's vehicle arrived. A white SUV with the Riverside County shield on the door. The deputy, a woman named Officer Castillo, got out with her hands loose at her sides. She introduced herself to Margaret and explained that she was there to facilitate emergency egress per county protocol. Margaret produced a printed document from the pocket of her robe. She had apparently gone inside and retrieved it, and handed it to Officer Castillo. It was Gerald Finch's legal memo. Margaret had anticipated this. Officer Castillo read the memo in about 90 seconds. She handed it back to Margaret. She said, Ma'am, I understand you have legal counsel, but a private attorney's memo does not supersede county emergency protocol. I'm asking you to open the gate or step aside. Margaret said, I'm asking you to present a court order. Officer Castillo said, calmly. That's not how this works in a declared emergency. Margaret said, then we have a problem. She smiled when she said it. I was watching all of this from 15 feet away and I was thinking, she practiced this. She had practiced this exact conversation. She had thought through every scenario and prepared a response. She was not panicking. She was executing a plan. The question was what the plan's end goal was. Delay? Humiliation? Control? I thought about the properties she'd quietly bought up. I thought about the Shell LLC. And I began to understand something that made my stomach drop. If the neighborhood evacuated through the northern exit, the fire's projected path, which I had seen in county documents, would likely hit several homes on the eastern edge of the community hardest. 4 of those homes were ones Margaret now owned through her LLC. If they burned, she could collect insurance. If they didn't, she still owned them. The evacuation route through the eastern gate would have taken residents past those homes. I was standing in the parking lot of a crime scene and I was just now seeing the outlines of it. I texted Phil Okafor, do you know if any of the properties in the fire's projected path are owned by Margaret Holloway via an LLC? It was 6:59 a.m. Phil texted back 11 minutes later. Checking. Why? I sent him the LLC name I'd found in the county property records 3 months ago, the one I'd noted but not followed up on. Cascade Property Holdings, LLC. He went quiet for 6 minutes. Then, Claire, for properties. I need you to call me. I stepped away from the scene to call Phil. He had pulled the insurance records through a contact at the county assessor's office, something he could do because of his real estate practice. 3 of the 4 Cascade Property Holdings homes had been recently reinsured at significantly elevated valuations. The 4th had a lapsed policy. Phil said, I can't prove anything from here, but this pattern. He stopped. He said, be very careful what you say to anyone right now. I said, I'm standing at the gate. He said, I know. Keep recording. I had been recording on my phone since I arrived. Not conspicuously, it was in my jacket pocket, audio only. This was legal in California as a single-party recording. Everything Margaret had said since I arrived was on tape. I had also sent Sandra Reyes 2 time-stamped text messages describing the obstruction in my own words. I was building a record and Margaret didn't know how many layers of it there were. Margaret had made a phone call of her own while I was on with Phil. When I returned to my position near the bus, I noticed that Todd, her assistant, had arrived in a Honda Civic and was standing behind her with a laptop open. He looked miserable. He also looked like he was being directed to document the scene from her perspective. I filed that away. Todd was 24. He was not the architect of any of this. He was just scared. The smoke was thicker now. Marcus, the bus driver, had opened the bus door and the children were visible, some of them holding each other. One girl in a pink backpack was standing at the top of the stairs, looking out. Maya's age, I thought. I turned back to the gate. Officer Castillo was on her radio. Margaret was holding her silk robe closed against the morning wind. Earl was standing very still. I looked at the ridge. The orange was brighter. At 7:08, Sandra Reyes called me directly. She said, Ms. Nguyen, we've escalated. Can you confirm the obstruction is still in place and that there is one individual maintaining it? I confirmed. She said, we have a county emergency declaration that covers this access point. We're sending asset authorization to the scene. Estimated arrival, 30 to 35 minutes. I said, Sandra, the fire is moving. She said, I know. We're moving faster. 35 minutes. I looked at the ridge. I looked at Marcus. I looked at the girl in the pink backpack. Margaret had moved to stand directly in front of the gate, her back against it, as if she intended to be a physical barrier if it came to that. She had stopped speaking. She was simply present, immovable, her expression unreadable. I had never admired and despised a person in the same moment before. This was that moment. Rosa Delgado walked up beside me. She said, very quietly, "Do you know what she's doing?" I said I had an idea. Rosa said, "She's gambling that no one will physically remove her, that they'll back down before she does. She's done it before." I looked at Rosa. "At a gate." Rosa shook her head. "At a water main dispute 3 years ago, before you moved here. She stood in front of the utility crew for 4 hours and they left." I said, "They weren't in a mandatory evacuation." The crowd of residents along Sycamore Lane had grown to maybe 30 people. Some were in cars, engines running. Some were on foot. A few had children with them. None of them knew what I knew about the Shell LLC. None of them knew what Sandra had told me. They only knew that Margaret Holloway was standing in front of the gate and the sky to the east was getting darker. I saw at least 3 of them filming on their phones. Good. At 7:17, Margaret did something I did not expect. She turned to the gathered residents and spoke. Not to me, not to Officer Castillo, to them. She said, "I want you all to know that I am protecting this community, as I have always done. There are people here today who want to hand over our neighborhood's autonomy to the county government. I will not allow that." A few people exchanged glances. One woman I recognized, a board member named Felicia, started to applaud, then seemed to change her mind halfway through. It was a brilliant move. She was turning a criminal obstruction into a political stand. She was framing government response to a wildfire as bureaucratic overreach. In a different context, with a different crowd, it might have worked. But the smoke was visible from where every one of those 30 residents was standing. A man in the back with a German shepherd said, loudly, "Margaret, my kids are at that school." She said, "The northern route is perfectly safe." He said, "It's not, and you know it." His name, I would learn later, was Jeff Hartman. He was an insurance actuary. He knew exactly what he was talking about. He pushed through to the front of the crowd and stood next to Officer Castillo. He looked at Margaret and said, "I have the county fire behavior model on my phone. I pulled it this morning. The northern route passes within a half-mile of the fire's projected leading edge at current wind speed. The eastern route clears the zone entirely." Margaret did not look at his phone. She said, "I didn't ask for your analysis, Jeff." Jeff showed his phone to Officer Castillo. She looked at it. Then she looked at Margaret. She said, "Ma'am, I am formally requesting that you vacate this access point. This is your second notification. If you do not comply, I am authorized to effect removal under California Emergency Management Code." Margaret said, "I'd like to see that code citation in writing." I almost couldn't believe she said that, but I had watched her for 3 years. She always asked for everything in writing because it always took time to produce. Officer Castillo did not have it in writing. That was the problem. She had her training and her radio and her judgment, but the specific code section was not in her patrol car. She was doing everything right, but Margaret had found the seam and she was pressing it. I watched Officer Castillo's face and I could see the moment she decided she needed backup. She stepped away and spoke into her radio. Margaret watched her go and allowed herself a very small, very private smile. She thought she was winning. I called Sandra Reyes again. I said, "She's stalling. She knows the deputy doesn't have the written code section." Sandra said, "I know. That's why we're sending something other than a deputy." I said, "What are you sending?" She said, "I can't say over the phone. But Ms. Nguyen, stay calm, stay visible, keep recording, and do not let that bus leave the scene." I said, "I won't," she said. "And Claire, you did everything right. This is our problem now." I hung up and turned back to the scene. Marcus was sitting on the bus steps. The children inside were quieter now, which was somehow more frightening than the crying. Earl Simmons had brought a folding chair from his truck and was sitting on it near the gate, arms folded, watching. Margaret had accepted a bottle of water from Todd and was sipping it with the composure of someone at a board meeting. I felt a fury that had no useful outlet, and I converted it, the way I always did, into watching and recording. At 7:24, two things happened nearly simultaneously. A news van from a Riverside TV station turned onto Sycamore Lane, and a second phone call came in from a number I recognized as the county supervisor's direct office. The supervisor, Maria Chun, who I had emailed twice about the gate and received form responses from, was apparently awake and was apparently aware of what was happening. I picked up the call. Supervisor Chen's aide was on the line, not the supervisor herself, but she was thorough and direct. She confirmed that the supervisor had been briefed, that the county was treating this as an obstructed emergency egress incident, and that the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services had been notified at 7:05 a.m. She asked me to confirm my identity and my location. I did. She said, "Stay where you are. Don't speak to the media yet." I said, "Understood." She hung up. The news van had parked at the end of the block. A reporter and a cameraman were approaching on foot. Margaret saw them, and I watched her recalibrate in real time. She straightened. She adjusted her robe. She turned to face the camera with the expression she always wore at board meetings. Composed, authoritative, invested with righteous purpose. She was going to give them a story. I let her. I stepped back slightly so I was not in the shot. The reporter introduced herself as Amber Wells from Channel 4. She pointed her microphone at Margaret and said, "Can you tell us what's happening here?" Margaret said, "I am the president of the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association, and I am here to ensure that my community's legally established rights are respected, even in an emergency. The county cannot simply override private property governance without due process." Amber said, "But there are children on that bus." Margaret said, "The northern route is available and safe." Amber turned to Officer Castillo, who gave a careful statement about the ongoing response. Then Amber looked at the crowd, and her eye landed on Jeff Hartman, who was still holding his phone. He explained the fire behavior model, the route comparison, and the 12-minute difference with the precision of an actuary. The cameraman filmed the smoke plume behind him. This was going to be the broadcast Margaret had not planned for. I watched Margaret's expression while Jeff spoke. She was still composed, but something behind her eyes was moving quickly, processing, revising. She was not stupid. She was seeing the scene the way a viewer at home would see it. A woman in a silk robe standing in front of a padlocked gate, 23 children on the bus behind her, orange sky above, and a resident with data in his hand. She was trying to calculate whether the story was still controllable. It was not. And 30 minutes from my phone call to Sandra Reyes, at 7:28 a.m., two vehicles turned onto Sycamore Lane that were not sheriff's department, not fire department, not county supervisor. They were olive drab. They had U.S. Army plates. They were Humvees. And they belonged to the California National Guard. I had not called the National Guard. I want to be clear about that because it matters. What I had done over the previous 2 years was build a documented record and place it in front of the right people. What Sandra Reyes had done over the previous 90 minutes was activate a state emergency protocol that I had helped make visible. The guard was Sandra's asset, not mine. I was simply the person who had made sure the door was unlocked for her. Tạm lắng. The two Humvees stopped 40 feet from the gate. For soldiers got out. They were in full-duty uniform, not combat gear. This was not a military operation. It was a logistical support deployment, which I would later learn is a specific activation category under California's emergency management framework. They were there to support county personnel, not to replace them. They stood calmly beside their vehicles, and a senior NCO, a staff sergeant, walked to Officer Castillo and conferred. Margaret was watching the Humvees. She had stopped performing for the camera, at least for a moment. Her face was doing something complicated. I recognized the calculation happening behind it. She was revising her legal position in real time, checking it against what she was seeing, and finding that Finch's memo had not prepared her for this. She had planned for a county deputy. She had not planned for the National Guard. I looked at Marcus, the bus driver. He was standing at the foot of the bus stairs, watching the soldiers, and something had changed in his posture. He was straighter, steadier, like a man who had been told help was coming and now believed it. I felt the same thing, and I had been the one who'd made the calls. Even I had not been entirely sure it would come. The staff sergeant, his name tag said Morales, walked to Margaret with Officer Castillo beside him. He introduced himself, stated his unit and his activation authority, and said that under the California Emergency Management Framework his deployment included authority to facilitate access through counter-recorded emergency egress points. He was clear, respectful, and completely immovable. He was very different from the county deputy. He had the written code in his tablet. Margaret said, "Sergeant, I want you to understand that this gate is administered by the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association under our governing documents. Your activation authority is a county matter. It does not supersede private HOA governance." Sergeant Morales looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, this gate is recorded as a county emergency egress easement. I have that document in my hand." He held up his tablet. "HOA governance doesn't apply to county easements." He said it the way people say things that are simply true. Margaret looked at the document on the tablet. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I'd like to verify that document's authenticity before I comply." Sergeant Morales said, "You're welcome to verify it, but I'm opening the gate while you do." He turned to one of his soldiers. "Specialist, bolt cutters." Margaret said, "You can't cut that lock." Sergeant Morales said, "I won't need to if you give me the key." The crowd was silent. The news camera was rolling. The smoke behind the ridge had thickened into a full column. Margaret held the silence for exactly 4 seconds. Then she reached into the pocket of her silk robe and produced a small brass key. She held it in her palm. She did not hand it over immediately. She said, "I want it on record that I am complying under protest, and that I consider this a violation of community rights." Sergeant Morales said, "Noted. The key, ma'am." She placed it in his hand. He walked to the gate. He unlocked it. The iron gate swung open and Sycamore Lane connected to the County Fire Road for the first time in an emergency. Marcus was back in his driver's seat before the gate was fully open. The bus rolled through smoothly. 23 children were moving away from the fire. I stood very still and let myself breathe. The camera followed the bus through the gate. Amber Wells was speaking into her microphone. Margaret was standing where she'd been, arms at her sides now, key no longer in her possession, looking at the open gate. The crowd of residents began moving, some to their cars, some toward the gate on foot. Earl Simmons folded his chair, picked it up, and walked past Margaret without saying anything. Rosa Delgado stopped beside me and put her hand on my arm briefly without a word. Margaret did not leave immediately. She stood there for another 4 minutes while the residents streamed past. I know because I was watching her. At one point she looked directly at me across the clearing, and I looked back. I did not smile. I did not say anything. She turned and walked to her Escalade and drove away, not through the eastern gate, not through the northern exit. She drove back into Pinecrest, toward her house, which was the direction the fire was coming from. She blocked the evacuation bus. I called the National Guard and took back control right in front of her. Daniel had followed the evacuation route through the eastern gate with Maya minutes earlier, and I'd watched their car pass through before I turned back to deal with the aftermath. Sandra Reyes called me at 7:41 to confirm the gate was open and all registered residents were being accounted for. She also told me, in a careful voice, that the county had opened a formal incident report on the obstruction event. Margaret Holloway was named as the obstructing party. That report was now a public record. The fire burned through the eastern ridge for 11 hours. The neighborhood was under mandatory evacuation for 3 days. When we were allowed back in, the eastern edge of Pinecrest had been spared. The firefighters had used the county fire road, now accessible through our open gate, to run a backfire line that stopped the advance a quarter-mile from the first home. That quarter-mile contained 4 properties owned by Cascade Property Holdings, LLC, Margaret's shell company. I learned this from Phil Okafor when I called him from the hotel where Daniel and Maya and I were staying during the evacuation. Phil had been busy during those 3 days. He had a contact at the State Department of Insurance who had flagged the Cascade Holdings properties after Phil sent over the insurance documents he'd pulled. There was now an inquiry. Phil said, "Don't talk to anyone from her HOA attorney's office." I said, "I never do." He said, "I mean, don't even be polite." The Channel 4 segment ran the night of the fire. I had not spoken to Amber Wells on camera. I'd followed the supervisor's aide's instruction. But Jeff Hartman had given a thorough and precise interview. Earl Simmons had spoken briefly and gravely about emergency access, and the footage of the National Guard opening the gate while 23 children's bus rolled through was the kind of visual that doesn't need narration. The segment ran 4 minutes, which is very long for local news. By morning, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. Margaret did not appear in the news segment as she had intended. She appeared as a woman in a silk robe holding a padlocked gate closed while children evacuated behind her. 2 neighbors called me the next day to tell me they'd cried watching it. One of them was Felicia, the board member who'd half started to applaud Margaret in the street. She said, "I didn't know about the properties." She meant the LLC. I said, "I know." She said, "What do we do?" I said, "Wait for the right moment." The HOA meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday after evacuees were allowed back in. Margaret sent a notice that it would proceed as planned. This was either confidence or momentum. She was not going to visibly retreat. I received a separate call from Todd, her assistant, on the Sunday before the meeting. He sounded like someone calling from inside a burning building. He said, "Ms. Nguyen, I need to talk to someone and I don't know who else to call." I said, "Come to my house." Todd arrived at my door that Sunday evening looking like he hadn't slept properly since the fire. He was 24, a recent college graduate who had taken the HOA administrator job because it paid decently and he needed health insurance. He sat at my kitchen table and told me about the previous 4 years in a voice that kept threatening to break. I listened. Daniel brought him coffee. Maya, who had been sent upstairs, apparently stayed at the top of the stairs and listened too, which I found out later. What Todd told me covered 6 pages of my notes, which I took with his knowledge and permission. He had been Margaret's instrument, sending violation notices she composed, organizing votes she'd predetermined, filtering community emails before they reached other board members. He had done these things because she told him to, and because he was 21 when he started and did not fully understand what he was participating in. He understood now. He wanted to know if he was in legal trouble. I called Phil from the kitchen while Todd sat there. Phil said, "Cooperate fully and be honest." That was the path. Todd also told me something I hadn't known. The proposed bylaw amendment, The one I'd helped defeat at the August meeting was not Margaret's first attempt to gain formal control over emergency access. She had tried a version of it in 2021 under different language, and it had passed without significant scrutiny. That amendment was still technically in the HOA governing documents. It had never been used, and its legal validity was questionable under state law, but it was there. Phil said that needed to go immediately. I spent the week between the fire and the HOA meeting preparing carefully. Phil had formally entered the case. The county OES had issued a compliance notice to the HOA requiring the eastern gate to be accessible by emergency personnel at all times, with a spare key held by County Fire Services. The State Department of Insurance inquiry was ongoing. Margaret had not issued any public statement. Her silence was strategic. She was still calculating. That made her more dangerous, not less. What I didn't anticipate was that Margaret was also preparing, and she had more resources than I'd realized. She had, in the week after the fire, engaged a second attorney, not Finch, a different firm in Los Angeles, and they had sent a letter to the county OES contesting the compliance notice. She had also personally called at least 8 homeowners in the neighborhood. I would learn later to explain her perspective. She was working the board. She was not done. Felicia came to me 3 days before the HOA meeting with a recording on her phone. She had recorded a call with Margaret without telling her. I was briefly uncomfortable with this ethically, then remembered that California is a 2-party consent state for telephone calls. But Felicia had researched this too, and she told me the call had been on speakerphone in a shared room which had different legal parameters. Phil confirmed it was probably admissible. The recording was 22 minutes long. I listened to it twice. Margaret's voice on the recording was different from the Margaret I knew in public, warmer, more confiding, more human-sounding. She told Felicia that the national media coverage had been orchestrated by me, that I was connected to county interests who wanted to absorb HOA independence, and that the real victim in all of this was the community she had built and protected for 11 years. She was not shouting. She was persuading. It was worse than shouting. She also said something near the end of the recording that made Phil go very quiet when I read him the transcript. She told Felicia that she had information about my engineering license that she intended to bring forward if I continued interfering with HOA governance. This was not a real threat. There was nothing wrong with my license. It was current and clean, but the intent to intimidate was clear and documented. Phil said this constituted potential harassment. He drafted a letter to Margaret's new attorney that evening. I told Daniel about the threat that night. He put down his fork and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to know it's nothing and that it won't work." He said, "I know it's nothing. I'm asking what you need." I told him I needed the HOA meeting to go a certain way, and I needed everyone to hold their positions until the right moment. He said, "Tell me what to do." That was the moment I understood we were going to be okay. The HOA meeting on the second Tuesday after the fire had the highest attendance in Pinecrest Estates history. 67 residents in a room that held 50 comfortably. People were standing in the doorway and along the back wall. Margaret arrived last, which I suspect was deliberate. She walked in at exactly the scheduled start time, dressed in a blazer and pearls, composed as a statue. She sat at the head table and called the meeting to order like nothing had happened. Her opening statement was, I will admit, impressive in its audacity. She acknowledged the fire. She acknowledged the evacuation. She praised the community's resilience. She credited the county fire crews and the National Guard. She did not mention the gate. She did not mention the bus. She moved directly to Agenda Item 1, a motion to formally commend the HOA board for its leadership during the emergency. The motion was her own. She had written it herself. I raised my hand during public comment. Margaret said, Ms. Nguyen, 2 minutes. I stood. I said, before we commend the board's leadership, I'd like to enter into the record the County OES incident report from the morning of August 14th, which documents a 47-minute delay in emergency egress caused by an obstruction at the eastern service gate. I placed 3 copies on the table. The room was very quiet. I sat down. Margaret said the report was under review and contested by HOA legal counsel. Felicia, from her seat at the board table, said, Margaret, I'd like to hear more about that. Margaret looked at her. Something passed between them. Felicia held her gaze. It was the first time I had ever seen a board member hold Margaret's gaze in 4 years of meetings. Todd, sitting at the recording secretary's desk, was very carefully not looking at anyone. A resident named Gary Park stood during the open comment period without being called on. Just stood, because the room was that kind of tense, and said, My son was on that bus. Margaret said, Gary, please wait to be recognized. Gary said, My son was on that bus, Margaret. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it. 3 or 4 people around him nodded slowly. Another parent, a woman I didn't know by name, started crying quietly. Gary sat down. Margaret moved to the next agenda item. But she couldn't, because Jeff Hartman stood up immediately after Gary. And then Rosa Delgado. And then Earl Simmons. And then, to my surprise, a man named Victor Patel, who had been denied a fence variance 3 years ago and had never spoken at an HOA meeting in my recollection. Each of them had something different to say. None of them was coordinated with the others. That was important. This wasn't a campaign. This was a community responding to what had happened to them. Margaret called for order 3 times. She actually gavelled the meeting. She had a gavel, and the 3rd time she brought it down so hard a woman near the front startled. The room did not settle the way she wanted. It settled the way rooms settle when the people in them have already decided something and are just waiting for the right question to be asked. I had seen this once before at a city council meeting years ago. The air in the room was different after a decision has already been made by the people in it. The decision came from an unexpected direction. Felicia, quiet, cautious, always aligned with the board, leaned forward to her microphone and said, I'd like to make a motion. Margaret said, We're in the middle of open comment, Felicia. Felicia said, I'd like to make a motion to table all current agenda items and open a formal board inquiry into the events of August 14th. She said it the way you say something you've been rehearsing for days. 2 seconds of silence. Then a board member named Howard, who had been on the board for 3 years and had barely spoken in any meeting I'd attended, said, I second. Margaret said, That motion is out of order. Phil Okafor, who I had invited to attend as a community member since he lived in the adjacent county, stood from the back and said, Actually, under Robert's rules as incorporated in the HOA bylaws, section 4.2, a motion to table is always in order during any agenda phase. He was correct. I had confirmed it that morning. Margaret looked at Phil. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at Felicia and Howard. She said, A vote requires a quorum of the board. Howard said, We have quorum. There are 5 of us here. Margaret said, I am chair. I haven't recognized the motion. Phil said from the back, Under your own bylaws, section 4.2, subsection B, a motion to table can be self-recognizing if seconded by a board member in good standing. Ms. Felicia is in good standing. Mr. Howard is in good standing. Margaret said, Sit down. Phil sat down. He did not stop being right. The vote was 3-2 in favor of tabling. Margaret and her oldest ally on the board, a man named Rick, who had been approving her motions for 8 years, voted against. Howard, Felicia, and a quietly terrified board member named Lisa voted in favor. Margaret said, "The motion fails. The chair has casting vote in a 3-2 split." Phil stood again gently and said, "Your bylaws, Section 6, subsection D, specify that the casting vote applies only to tie votes. 3-2 is not a tie." There was a ripple of sound in the room that was not quite laughter. It was the sound of people understanding something at the same time. Margaret took a breath. She was still composed. Her composure was structural, built into her like load-bearing walls, but something had cracked slightly inside it. She said, "This meeting is adjourned." Howard said, "You can't adjourn during a live motion." Margaret stood, gathered her papers, and walked toward the door. Phil said, still from the back, pleasantly, "A board member may leave, but the meeting remains in session if quorum is maintained." Margaret stopped walking. The room was completely silent. She turned around. She stood at the back of the room and looked at the 67 people sitting in a space designed for 50. She looked at the 3 board members who had just voted against her. She looked at Todd, who was still at the recording secretary's desk, hands folded, not typing, not performing, just sitting there with his eyes down. She looked at me. I met her eyes. I did not look away. She walked back to the head table and sat down. She set her papers in front of her and she said, in a perfectly level voice, "The meeting is in session. The motion to open a board inquiry carries. The inquiry will begin next week. I'll appoint the subcommittee." Howard said, "Respectfully, Margaret, the inquiry should be chaired by someone who is not a subject of it. I'd like to nominate Felicia to chair." Margaret said, "That's against procedure." Phil started to stand. Margaret said, "Fine. Felicia can chair." The meeting continued. I left the meeting at 9:47 p.m. Earl Simmons caught up with me in the parking lot. He said, "She's still going to fight." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what she's going to do?" I said, "She's going to try to turn the inquiry into a process she controls. She's going to delay, contest, and eventually try to reframe everything as a governance dispute rather than a safety obstruction." Earl said, "That's about right." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Make sure the inquiry doesn't need her cooperation to conclude." Phil and I met for 3 hours the next morning. We had the OES incident report. We had Todd's testimony, which he had agreed to provide in writing. We had Felicia's recording of the phone call. We had the county easement documents. We had 3 years of my folders. We had the insurance records Phil had pulled on the Cascade properties. We had Margaret's own words on my audio recording from the gate. Phil said, "She's looking at more than a HOA removal. She may be looking at a county obstruction charge and a state insurance fraud investigation." He said it without satisfaction. It was simply what the evidence pointed to. The inquiry subcommittee, Felicia, Howard, and a resident attorney named Dennis who had volunteered, met for the first time that Thursday. Margaret sent a letter through her new LA attorney stating that she would not participate in any inquiry chaired by Felicia on the grounds of conflict of interest. The subcommittee noted the objection in the record and proceeded without her. Todd appeared before them the following Monday and gave 5 hours of testimony. I was told he cried once near the end. I was not there for that. Margaret made her next move on the Friday of that same week. It was elegant in the way she was elegant, and it told me more about how she'd been operating all along than anything else she'd done. She sent a formal notice to all HOA residents announcing that due to ongoing administrative challenges, she was calling a special election for a full board recall and refresh. All current board seats, including her own, would be up for immediate election. New nominees had 1 week to declare. At first, I didn't understand it. Then Phil explained. She was betting that her network, the years of small favors, the holiday wine, the approved variances, would deliver her a new board majority. She was burning the current board before they could burn her, and she intended to get elected back in at the head of a new one. It was the kind of move that worked if your opponent didn't see it coming. I had been watching her for 3 years. I saw it coming. I declared as a board candidate the next morning. So did Earl Simmons. So did Jeff Hartman. So did Felicia, for her own seat. Dennis, the attorney from the inquiry subcommittee, declared for a 5th seat. Margaret filed her own nomination, naturally, along with Rick, her loyalist. She also nominated 2 people I didn't recognize. I later found they were the adult children of residents she'd helped with landscaping disputes. She was filling the slate. The week of campaigning before the special election was unlike anything I had experienced in Pinecrest Estates or anywhere else I had ever lived. Margaret organized a candidate forum in the community room where she controlled the agenda, the speaking order, and the microphone. I attended, spoke when I was permitted to, and said exactly what I had documented without editorializing. Earl spoke about the fire road. Jeff spoke about the risk models. Dennis spoke about due process. Margaret spoke about 11 years of service and community standards. Rick echoed her. The forum audience was different from the one at the HOA meeting, quieter, more nervous. These were people who had HOA violations pending, or who had upcoming projects that needed board approval, or who had simply gotten used to calculating the cost of displeasing Margaret before making any decision about their property. She had trained this neighborhood over a decade to weigh her preferences before their own. That was the deepest thing she had built, and it was harder to dismantle than any bylaw. On the 3rd day of the campaign week, Margaret sent a mailer to every household in Pinecrest. It was printed on professional paper, for pages, full color. It presented a timeline of her HOA leadership with specific accomplishments: the Rose Garden, the community pool refurbishment, the road repaving in 2020, the holiday decorating contest. The bus incident was framed in one brief paragraph as an emergency access coordination issue that has since been resolved cooperatively with county authorities. I read it 4 times. The mailer was expensive. Professional graphic design, full color, delivered to 142 households. I estimated it cost between $2,000 and $4,000. HOA funds could not be used for a political campaign. That was explicit in the bylaws. I requested a financial accounting from Todd, who was still serving as recording secretary. He provided it. The mailer had been paid from the HOA General Fund, under the line item Community Communications. Phil sent a formal objection to the inquiry subcommittee. 2 days before the election, Margaret did something I had not anticipated. She contacted Gary Park, the father of the boy who had been on the bus. I don't know exactly what she said, because Gary has never told me the full content of the conversation, and I haven't asked. What I know is that Gary withdrew his public support from our slate and stopped attending the candidate events. His wife told my neighbor that he had decided to stay neutral. She looked tired when she said it. I did not reach out to Gary. It was not my place. But Rosa Delgado did. She called him on her own, and she told him what Todd had told the inquiry subcommittee about the sequence of events at the gate, including that Margaret had been aware of the fire timeline before she drove to block it. Rosa told me later that Gary had gone quiet on the phone for a long time. Then he said, "She knew." Rosa said yes. Gary said he needed to think. He came back to us 2 days later. He never explained what he had decided, and I didn't ask him to. The special election took place on a Saturday morning in the community room. Voting was by paper ballot, witnessed by a volunteer from the county clerk's office that Phil had arranged, because no one trusted the existing HOA to self-administer. 91 of the 142 households voted, which was the highest participation rate in the HOA's history. I know because Todd told me later, and he had been keeping records. The count took 2 hours. Margaret sat in the front row of the community room the entire time, perfectly still, watching the volunteers sort and count. I sat in the back. Earl sat next to me. He fell asleep briefly, which I found deeply calming. Jeff Hartman was at a table near the window doing something on his laptop that turned out to be preparing the election certification documentation. He had looked up the proper format the night before. Of course he had. The results were read aloud by the county volunteer. Claire Nguyen, Earl Simmons, Jeffrey Hartman, Felicia Torres, and Dennis Ramos had been elected to the 5 board seats. Margaret Holloway had received 23 votes, the 4th highest total among unsuccessful candidates. Rick had received 19. The 2 people Margaret had nominated received 11 and 9 votes respectively. The room made a sound that was not quite cheering and not quite crying. It was something in between. Margaret stood up. She looked at the vote tally sheet for about 5 seconds. Then she looked at me. Her expression was not rage. It was not grief. It was not defeat in any ordinary sense. It was the look of someone who has been playing a very long game and has just realized that the other player has been playing the same game, at the same level, without her knowing. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then her face went back to its usual composure. She picked up her purse and walked out. I was elected board president by a 4-to-1 vote among the new board members. I had not asked for the position. Earl had nominated me. Jeff had seconded. Dennis and Felicia had voted yes. I told them I would serve 1 term, that the goal was to fix what needed fixing and build a board that didn't depend on any one person. They agreed. I asked Todd if he would stay on as recording secretary under the new board. He said yes so fast that I think he'd been afraid to hope I would ask. The first act of the new board was to formally remove Margaret Holloway from any HOA authority, rescind the emergency authority amendment she'd passed in 2021, provide the county fire department with permanent key access to the Eastern Gate, and commission an independent audit of HOA finances for the preceding 5 years. Margaret's new LA attorney sent a letter objecting to each of these actions. Phil reviewed them all. None of the objections had legal merit. I filed that with a deep satisfaction I allowed myself to feel exactly once. The financial audit took 3 weeks. What it found was not entirely surprising, given everything else, but it was still sobering to see it laid out. Over 5 years, approximately $38,000 had been misallocated from HOA funds to cover expenses that benefited Margaret's properties or her political campaigns within the HOA, the professional mailer. Landscaping work done on Cascade Holdings properties charged to the community fund. A legal retainer for Gerald Finch that exceeded the board-approved amount by $7,000. Phil forwarded the audit to the county DA's office with a formal letter. The State Department of Insurance forwarded their own inquiry findings the same week. I was not copied on the DA letter directly, but Phil described its contents to me. He said, "We've laid out the facts clearly. What happens next is up to the DA." I said, "What do you think happens next?" He paused and said, "I think something happens. I don't know how fast." That was honest, and I respected it. Margaret did not leave quietly. I want to be clear about that, because this story could make it seem like her removal was the end of her campaign. It was not. She sent a 40-page rebuttal to the county OES contesting the incident report. She filed a motion in civil court to invalidate the HOA election on procedural grounds. The motion cited 17 alleged deficiencies in the election process, all of which Phil addressed in a response brief that was, if I'm being honest, a masterpiece of controlled demolition. She also began attending neighborhood events, the fall block party, the trail cleanup, the holiday light judging, as a private citizen, with a smile and a casserole, rebuilding the social infrastructure she'd always relied on. Several neighbors told me they'd run into her and she'd seemed really gracious about everything. I said, "That's good to hear," which was not untrue. I also made a note of it. I had learned to document everything, and I did not stop because the immediate crisis had passed. The civil motion to invalidate the election was dismissed in November. The judge's ruling was 2 sentences. The election had been conducted in compliance with both HOA bylaws and California corporation statutes, and the petitioner had not established any material procedural defect. Margaret's new attorney billed her for the motion. I learned later from Todd that the bill had been $4,200. He had seen the invoices because Margaret had briefly asked him to process payment before he explained he no longer worked for her. The county DA's office contacted Phil in December. They were opening a formal investigation into the events of August 14th, specifically the obstruction of a counter-recorded emergency egress point during a mandatory evacuation, and related questions about intent and prior knowledge. Margaret was not yet charged, but she was under investigation, which meant every document she had ever filed with the county, every financial record connected to the HOA and Cascade Holdings, and the Finch legal memo were now in the hands of people with subpoena authority. Gerald Finch, Margaret's original HOA attorney, called Phil in mid-December. I was not on the call, but Phil told me about it. Finch had been a peripheral figure in all of this, the author of the legal cover memo, the one who'd told Margaret her obstruction was legally sound. He was apparently having a reflective period. He had questions about his own exposure. Phil told him, professionally and without drama, that Finch's best option was to make himself available to investigators and be completely honest. Finch said, "How honest?" Phil said, "Completely." Christmas came. Maya put up a small rock collection in the living room window as an alternative to a nativity scene, which was very her. Daniel made lasagna. I sat at the dining table for the first time in 2 years without a folder in front of me, and I realized I didn't know what to do with my hands. Daniel noticed and put a glass of wine in them. I laughed. It was the best thing I'd felt since the bus had rolled through the gate. The first HOA meeting of the new year had 12 agenda items, all of which were practical. Gate maintenance, a new landscaping subcommittee, a revised violation reporting process that included independent review, updated financial controls, a community emergency preparedness plan developed with the county fire district. I ran the meeting using Robert's rules, which I had memorized. Took 90 minutes. 3 residents told me afterward it was the most efficient meeting they'd attended in years. One said it was the only one she'd been to where she hadn't felt afraid. In February, the state insurance commissioner's office issued a formal finding that 3 of the 4 Cascade Holdings properties had been fraudulently overinsured, and that the insurance policies had been obtained using materially misleading documentation about property condition and use. Margaret received notice of the finding and a demand for an administrative hearing. Phil said this was separate from but related to the DA investigation. 2 tracks moving in parallel toward the same person. I received a personal letter from Margaret in March. It was handwritten, 2 pages, on her personal stationery, cream paper, engraved initials. She wrote about her dedication to the community. She wrote about feeling misunderstood. She did not apologize for blocking the gate. She did not mention the 23 children. She did not mention the fire road or the 4 LLC properties or the $38,000. She said she hoped we could find a way to restore community harmony. I read it twice and placed it in the folder. My folder was now 149 pages. Phil called me the last week of March. He said the DA's office had reached a decision. I asked what it was. He said, "I think you should hear this in person." I drove to his office that afternoon. He was sitting behind his desk with a document in front of him, and he looked at me with the expression of a man delivering news he has been working toward for a long time. He said, "They're filing charges." I sat down. He told me what they were. I nodded. I thanked him. I drove home and I told Daniel. He said, "Is it over?" I said, "Almost." What Phil told me that afternoon in his office was that the DA was filing 2 charges against Margaret Holloway. The first, obstruction of emergency services under California Penal Code 148.2, a misdemeanor that carried potential jail time and a fine. The second, insurance fraud in connection with the Cascade Holdings properties, a felony under California Insurance Code 1871.4. The second charge was what changed everything. A misdemeanor was a fine and a conviction. A felony was a different kind of life. Margaret's response to the charges was swift and expensive. She hired a criminal defense attorney from a Los Angeles firm, not Finch, not the civil attorney, a woman named Catherine Bale who specialized in white-collar crime and had a reputation for aggressive discovery motions and meticulous delay. Phil knew her by reputation and said she was very good. He also said, with a certain professional clarity, being very good only works if the evidence isn't definitive. Ours is. Catherine Bale filed 17 pretrial motions in the first 6 weeks. I was not a party to the criminal case. The DA prosecuted, not me, but Phil kept me informed because the HOA's civil complaint, which we had filed separately, ran parallel to the DA's case. Bale's motions challenged the admissibility of the audio recording, the chain of custody of the financial audit, the authority of the county subpoena for HOA records, and 6 other procedural points. Every one of them had a basis in law. Every one of them lost. What Bale couldn't motion away was Todd. He had been cooperating with investigators since November. He had a written immunity agreement from the DA's office in exchange for complete and truthful disclosure. Todd testified before the grand jury in February and again in March, and what he told them, the specific instructions Margaret had given him, the documents he had processed, the emails he had seen, apparently gave the DA's case a backbone of contemporaneous witness testimony that made the documentary evidence even harder to contest. In April, Gerald Finch reached his own agreement with the DA's office. His cooperation was narrower than Todd's. He was not a direct witness to the Gate incident, but he was able to testify about the legal memo he had written for Margaret in 2019. Specifically about what she had told him she needed the memo to accomplish. What he told the DA, according to Phil's source at the courthouse, was that Margaret had explicitly instructed him to write a document that would give the board president emergency gate authority regardless of county easement status. She had known about the easement. She had always known. This was the thing I had suspected since I stood at the gate that morning and watched her produce Finch's memo from her pocket. She had carried it in her robe pocket. She had gone back into her house and retrieved it before coming to stand at the gate. She had known the gate was a county easement. She had known the county had the right to open it. And she had stood there anyway with Finch's memo as a prop, betting that no one on scene would know enough to refute it in real time. She had been almost right. The trial date was set for September, almost exactly 1 year after the fire. Margaret's attorneys filed for a continuance, citing scheduling conflicts and incomplete discovery. The continuance was partially granted. The date moved to November. During this time, Margaret continued to appear at community events. She had started volunteering at the neighborhood's pocket park. Weeding, mulching, arriving early and staying late. Several residents told me this. I acknowledged it. I did not go to the park while she was there. In June, the HOA civil case reached a settlement conference. Margaret, through Bale, offered to return $22,000 to the HOA general fund and resign from any future board eligibility. Phil and I discussed it. The new board voted on it. We rejected it. Not out of anger, I want to be precise about this, but because the offer did not include acknowledgement of the gate obstruction, and the families who had been at Pinecrest during the fire deserved a record that was clear and complete. We made a counter-demand that included a written statement of fact. Margaret declined. The case continued. In late July, something happened that I had not anticipated and that changed the temperature of everything. A profile was published in the Los Angeles Times. It was a long-form piece about HOA abuse of power in Southern California, and Pinecrest Estates was the centerpiece. The journalist, a woman named Carolyn Marsh, had been researching for 8 months. She had interviewed me for 5 hours in March. I had been careful, factual, and had provided her only documents already in the public record. She had also interviewed Earl, Jeff, Rosa, Gary Park, Todd, and 3 families who had left the neighborhood under Margaret's tenure, including the Garcias. The piece ran on a Sunday. By Monday morning, I had 46 voicemails and over 200 emails from people across California describing similar situations with their own HOAs. Phil called me and said, flatly, "You're going to need to decide how much of this you want to respond to." I said I didn't want to respond to any of it publicly. He said, "That's the right call." Sandra Reyes texted me, "Well done." That was the whole text. I saved it. Margaret's attorneys sent a cease and desist letter to the Los Angeles Times claiming the article contained defamatory statements. The Times's legal team responded within 48 hours. Every statement in the article about Margaret Holloway was sourced, documented, and confirmed by multiple parties. The cease and desist was withdrawn 8 days later. Carolyn Marsh called me to let me know. She was professional and understated about it. I liked her for that. The DA's office, in August, added a 3rd charge, filing a false instrument with a public agency, connected to the 2021 Emergency Authority bylaw amendment that Margaret had pushed through without full board disclosure of its legal implications. This charge was the one Gerald Finch's testimony most directly supported. It was a misdemeanor, but combined with the felony insurance fraud charge, the picture of Margaret Holloway that the prosecution was building was not of someone who had made a mistake or overstepped in a moment of crisis. It was of someone who had systematically constructed a framework of control over a period of years, using legal forms as tools. In September, 2 weeks before the amended trial date, Margaret's lead attorney Catherine Bale withdrew from the case. I heard this from Phil, who had heard it from a courthouse contact. The reason was not stated publicly, but Bale's departure from a case this close to trial was significant. It suggested either a fee dispute, a strategic disagreement, or something in the prosecution's evidence that she had concluded could not be beaten. Margaret hired a new attorney, a man named Robert Choi who was younger, less expensive, and less visible. Robert Choi immediately moved for a plea deal. The DA's office was in discussions. I was not party to those discussions, but Phil had been contacted by the DA's Victim Impact Coordinator, who asked if I or any other HOA residents wished to submit victim impact statements. I asked the new HOA board. We agreed that any resident who wished to submit one should be supported in doing so. 21 did. Gary Park submitted one. It was 2 paragraphs long. He let me read it before he filed it. I told him it was exactly right. The plea deal was finalized in late October. I learned its terms from Phil 2 days before it was announced publicly. Margaret Holloway would plead no contest to 1 count of obstruction of emergency services and 1 count of insurance fraud. The obstruction charge carried a 12-month suspended sentence, 3 years of probation, and a fine of $20,000, half of which was designated for the County Fire District's Community Preparedness Program. The insurance fraud charge carried an 18-month suspended sentence, concurrent probation, restitution to the insurance companies of approximately $112,000, and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any homeowners association in California. The permanent bar. That was the one that mattered. Not the fines, not the probation. The fact that Margaret Holloway could never again sit at the head of a board table and call a meeting to order and use the bylaws she'd written to remove the key from a gate. Phil said it quietly when he read it to me. Permanent bar from any HOA directorship in California. I sat with that sentence for a moment. Then I said, "Good." He said, "Yes." I called Sandra Reyes after I got off the phone with Phil. She had moved to a new position at the state OES office in Sacramento, a promotion she'd received in part, she told me, because of the Pinecrest response model, which was now being studied as an example of county-level emergency protocol working as intended. She answered on the second ring. I told her the plea deal terms. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The children got home safe." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's what matters." I agreed. I also knew it wasn't all that mattered. But it was the most that mattered. And that was enough for that phone call. The formal plea was entered in Riverside County Superior Court on a Wednesday morning in October. I did not attend. Felicia did, and texted me a single word when it was over. Done. Todd attended too, sitting in the back of the courtroom, and called me afterward. He said Margaret had entered the plea calmly, without visible emotion, in the same composed way she had done everything. The judge had read the terms. She had said no contest, and then she had walked out. Margaret's 4 Cascade Holdings properties were liquidated as part of the insurance fraud settlement. 2 sold to families I'd never met. 1 was purchased by Rosa Delgado and her husband. They had saved carefully for years, and the settlement pricing made it briefly possible. I found this out from Rosa herself, who called me one Sunday morning to tell me. Her voice had the quality of someone reporting an impossible good luck. I said, "Rosa, that's wonderful." She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in 3 years. The property directly next to Rosa's, one of the Cascade Holdings homes, was purchased by Gary Park. His son had been on the bus. He told me, when I ran into him at the trail cleanup in November, that he had thought about it for a long time and decided he wanted to put roots down in this neighborhood in a way that wasn't dependent on Margaret's approval or anyone else's. He said it simply the way he said most things. I told him that made sense. He nodded and went back to raking. Earl Simmons served 1 term on the new board, as he had agreed, and then retired gracefully with a party that the neighborhood threw him at the community room. He made a short speech that was mostly about the importance of fire-adapted landscaping and defensible space, which was fully in character. Someone had framed the photo of him sitting in his folding chair at the gate on the morning of August 14th, and they gave it to him. He looked at it for a long time and said, "Good morning to remember." I agreed. Jeff Hartman stayed on the board for 2 terms. He turned the HOA financial reporting into a model of transparency that was later cited by a California HOA reform organization as an example of best practices. He was quietly excellent at it. He never mentioned the fire risk model at board meetings unless it was directly relevant, which it sometimes was, because we had put together a community emergency preparedness committee that met twice a year, and he was always at those meetings with something new to share. Felicia stayed as well. She had a natural talent for keeping meetings civil without keeping them empty, which is harder than it sounds. She told me once, in the parking lot after a late meeting, that she had known for years that Margaret's governance wasn't right but had been afraid to say so, and that the guilt of that had been sitting on her for a long time. I said, "You said something when it counted." She said, "It almost wasn't in time." I said, "Almost doesn't count." She seemed to need that. I meant it. What I had not expected, in the months after the plea, was how much the neighborhood changed without the architecture of fear underneath it. Not dramatically, Pinecrest didn't become a utopia. People still disagreed about fence heights and parking and the speed of the landscaping committee's decisions. But the texture was different. Neighbors knocked on each other's doors without calculating whether it would look suspicious to Margaret. People came to HOA meetings without rehearsing what they would say if she cut them off. It was the ordinariness of it that moved me most. Maya noticed. Children notice things that run under the surface, that adults don't always name. She told me one evening, while we were on a walk on the trail behind the neighborhood, that the neighbors seemed less careful now. I asked her what she meant. She thought about it and said, like when you're holding your breath and then you stop. I told her that was exactly right. She picked up a piece of quartz from the path and put it in her pocket. She had a system for categorizing rocks that I had never fully understood but deeply respected. In December, I was asked by the County Office of Emergency Services to speak on a panel about the Pinecrest case at a statewide emergency management conference in Sacramento. I wrote my remarks carefully and checked each one against the documented record. I spoke for 12 minutes. I made no accusations. I described the chain of documentation, the importance of the county easement record, and what happened when a community-level obstacle met a properly activated emergency protocol. Sandra Reyes was in the audience. She nodded once near the end. That was sufficient. The LA Times piece had generated a small legislative response. A state assemblywoman whose district included several HOA-dense communities in Orange County introduced a bill in January requiring that county-recorded emergency access points be explicitly exempted from HOA jurisdiction in all governing documents statewide. The bill cited the Pinecrest case in its supporting language. Phil said this was rare, direct legislative response to a single case. I said it was what the case was for. He said, "You didn't plan that." I said, "No. But I planned for it to be documented well enough that someone else could." I served my full term on the board. When it ended, I did not seek re-election as I had promised. The new board that replaced ours included 2 residents I had barely known before the fire. A nurse named Angela who had moved in 2 years ago and a retired architect named Don who had been on the landscaping subcommittee with me. They were good. They were careful. They were not afraid of the work or of each other. I felt, handing over the committee binders at the transition meeting, something I can only describe as adequacy, the sense that what needed to be done had been done to the level it needed to be done. I kept in touch with Sandra Reyes. We met for coffee in Sacramento when I was there for the conference, and once more in Riverside when she was passing through for a regional meeting. She was the kind of person I would have been friends with regardless of circumstances, which made the circumstances feel slightly less like what they were. We talked about emergency protocol, about the bill, about her new work on community resilience frameworks. We also talked about entirely other things. I was glad for the entirely other things. In the spring after my board term ended, Daniel and I finally replaced our mailbox post. We had the correct beige, confirmed by 3 separate color swatches. Maya helped me paint it on a Saturday afternoon. She was methodical and precise about the edges in a way that reminded me of certain things I saw in myself and was glad to see in her. When we finished, she stood back and looked at it and said, "It looks the same." I said, "That's the point." She said, "Then why did it matter so much?" I thought about it. I said, "Because it was never about the mailbox." She thought about that for a while, the way she thought about things. Then she said, "It was about whether you had to ask permission to be yourself in your own house." I looked at her. She was 10. I said, "Yes, that's exactly what it was about." She nodded, satisfied, and went to look for more rocks. I sat on the front step for a while in the afternoon sun and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a long time. In the fall, about 14 months after the fire, I saw Margaret at the farmer's market in town. She was alone. She was buying tomatoes. She looked like herself, the white blonde bob, the good posture, the Lululemon jacket. But there was something about the way she moved through the space that was different. She wasn't organizing anything. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was just a woman buying tomatoes on a Saturday morning. I did not approach her. I bought peaches from the next stand over and went home. I told Daniel I had seen her. He said, "How did that feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Like the end of a chapter." He said, "Was it?" I said, "I think so." He said, "Good." He cut one of the peaches and gave me half. We stood in the kitchen and ate it. That was the morning I started writing this down. Not for anyone in particular, but because writing things down is the way I process them. And because some things should be recorded, not so they can be weaponized, but so they can be understood. Phil told me, when I called to catch him up, that Margaret had apparently moved to a different city, Pasadena or thereabouts, and was living quietly there. He didn't know for certain. She was still under probation, still making restitution payments. He thought she had sold her Pinecrest home. I hadn't noticed, which surprised me slightly. Then I realized why it hadn't registered. The house was just a house again. It didn't have the weight it had once had. Weight comes from what a place means, not from the building. I had lunch with Earl Simmons in March, a year and a half after the fire. He was 90% retired from everything: board, committees, neighborhood disputes. He spent most of his time gardening and occasionally visiting schools to talk about fire safety, which I thought was exactly the right use of his time and knowledge. He asked me how the new board was doing. I said it was doing well. He said, "You fixed the thing that needed fixing." I said, "We fixed it." He said, "You know what I mean." I did, but I wanted to say it right. There was a documentary film crew that reached out through the HOA the following spring, a streaming service, not a major one, doing a series on community power dynamics. They wanted to interview me, Earl, Jeff, Rosa, and potentially Margaret if she agreed. I discussed it with the board. We did not make a collective decision. It was each person's individual choice. I declined. Not because I was afraid of the attention or because I thought the story was wrong, but because the story as I'd lived it was complete. The camera would make it into something else. What I thought about, more than the fire or the gate or the trial, in the quiet time after everything, was the girl in the pink backpack. Standing at the top of the bus stairs, looking out the window at the smoke-orange sky. I didn't know her name. I never found out. She had been on that bus with 22 other children, and she had gotten home safe, and she would grow up and probably not remember that morning in any particular detail. That was exactly right. That was the whole point. The whole long chain of folders and meetings and phone calls and easement records and county protocols, it was for that. For the thing she wouldn't remember because it had resolved before it became a scar. Rosa Delgado invited me to the housewarming for her new property in April. The one she'd bought through the Cascade Holdings settlement sale. She had repainted the exterior in a warm terracotta that looked nothing like what had been there before. She had planted a small herb garden in the front bed. She served tamales and horchata and a tres leches cake that was one of the best things I had ever eaten. The house was full of her family, her kids, her parents who had driven up from Pomona, neighbors from the new block. It was loud and warm and completely, thoroughly itself. I stood in Rosa's backyard for a while that afternoon, holding a glass of horchata, watching her kids run around in the grass. Daniel was talking to her father about the Dodgers. Maya was in the corner showing Rosa's youngest something about rocks. She had brought a small collection in her jacket pocket, as she always did. I looked at the yard, the house, the light, the people. I thought, this is what the gate was for. Not the gate itself. I am not a person who believes in grand gestures or symbolic victories. I am an engineer. I think in systems, in load-bearing structures, in what holds and what gives. What I believe is that the systems that govern a community, the bylaws, the easements, the emergency protocols, the financial records, are load-bearing structures. They hold the weight of people's lives. When one person hollows them out and fills them with their own will, the structure looks intact from the outside. You can't always tell until something pushes on it hard enough. The fire pushed hard enough. The structure held, in the end, because enough people had been quietly reinforcing it. I keep the folder. All 149 pages of it, plus the court documents and the settlement records and the county OES report, in a fireproof box in our home office. Not because I think I'll need it. Because it is a record of something true. That one woman with a padlock and 11 years of practice at using rules against people could be stopped. And what it took to stop her. It took documentation. It took legal knowledge. It took the county easement record that I'd found in a courthouse parking lot for $14. It took Sandra Reyes. It took Earl Simmons and his folding chair. It took 23 children on a bus, and a driver named Marcus who didn't move. She blocked the evacuation bus. I called the National Guard and took back control right in front of her. I need to go back. I have been telling this story in a way that moves forward, but there are things that happened during the weeks between the gate and the trial that I have not fully told you because they are harder to tell. The moments when I was not composed. The moments when I was afraid, not of Margaret, but of what it cost to keep going. Those moments matter. They are part of the structure too. The night after the HOA special election, after we had won, after the vote count was done and the room had made that sound between cheering and crying, I drove home alone. Daniel was at a school event. Maya was at a sleepover. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 20 minutes. I was not relieved. I was not triumphant. I was depleted in a way I didn't have a word for. Like something structural in me had been under load for a very long time and the load had been suddenly removed and I didn't quite trust my own weight yet. I had told Daniel in the months before the election that I was fine. I had meant it mostly. I was functional. I was focused. I was building the case, attending the meetings, keeping the folders. But there was something I had not admitted to myself until I was sitting in that driveway. I had been running on the energy that comes from feeling responsible for something that no one else was handling. And when other people started handling it, Sandra, Phil, Earl, Felicia, I had felt, underneath the relief, a flash of something like loss. I had needed to be necessary. That is not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. I thought about my mother then. She had run the books for my father's dry cleaning business for 20 years. And when the landlord tripled their rent on a non-renewal clause and they had to close, she had worked 3 jobs for 2 years to help pay back the employees' severance. She never complained publicly. She organized everything. She kept the folder, in her case a literal shoebox with receipts. I had thought for years that I was nothing like her because I had a professional degree and a career and a language for what I did. That night in the driveway, I understood that I was exactly like her. And I cried once for about 5 minutes. Then I went inside and went to bed. The threat Margaret had made about my engineering license, the one on Felicia's recording, had been investigated and closed. There was nothing there because there was nothing there. But the weeks during which the investigation was open were uncomfortable in a particular professional way. I had disclosed the threat to my firm's HR as a precaution. My supervisor, a man named Cal who had known me for 7 years, had handled it with complete calm and told me I had done the right thing. I knew he meant it. I was still distracted for 3 weeks. What bothered me most about the license threat was not the threat itself. It was empty and Margaret had probably known it was empty, but what it revealed about how she had processed me over 3 years. I was not, to her, a person with legitimate concerns. I was an instrument to be neutralized. She had looked at me and seen a vulnerability, a professional credential, a reputation, something she could put pressure on, and she had stored it away until she needed it. I thought about everyone else she had done that to. The Garcias who had left. Rosa with her $300 fine. Earl with the sudden violation notices after he turned down the property offer. She had a file on all of us. Hers was just invisible. In the week before the DA announced charges, I received an email from Todd. It was short. He said he was leaving California, moving back to Portland where his family was. He said he wanted to thank me for not treating him like a villain, and he was sorry for the things he had done, and he hoped the neighborhood would be okay. I wrote back. I told him he had shown real courage by cooperating, and that I hoped Portland was good to him. I meant both things. He never wrote back. I hope he's doing well. Phil's fees were substantial. We had legal aid for the civil HOA case. The county legal aid organization had taken part of it pro bono because of the emergency egress component, but there were hours I paid for out-of-pocket. Daniel and I had savings. We used some of them. We did not talk about it much. He never asked me if it was worth it. He already knew. When I thanked him once in a general way, he said, "This is what we do." I thought about that for a long time. It matters who you do your life with. In August, exactly 1 year after the fire, I drove to the Eastern Gate alone, early in the morning. The gate was open. It was always open now, per the county compliance agreement, with a combination known to HOA personnel and county fire services both. I stood in the road where Margaret had stood. I looked east toward the ridge. The chaparral was growing back, which is what chaparral does. The ridge was green-gray in the morning light. There was no smoke. There was nothing threatening. I stood there for a while. Then I drove home and made coffee. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I was contacted by a journalist who was not Carolyn Marsh, a blogger, essentially, who ran a site about HOA horror stories. He wanted a comment. I declined, as I had declined everyone except Carolyn and the Sacramento panel. He wrote a piece anyway, using the public court documents which he was entitled to. He got several facts wrong. I sent a correction. He published a partial correction. I let it go. Not everything requires a response. That had taken me a while to learn, but I had learned it. What I was thinking about in the weeks before the trial, before the plea changed everything, was not victory. Victory was not a useful frame for any of this, because victory would have meant the gate had opened easily, the children had gone through without delay, Margaret had stepped aside, and none of the last 3 years had been necessary. There was no version of this story where I had won something. There was only a version where a serious harm had been stopped before it became irreversible, and accountability had been established. Those were not the same as winning. They were more important than winning. Daniel asked me once, when the case was deep in pretrial motions and we hadn't had a weekend without some related phone call or document review in weeks, whether I thought about what it would have been like to just leave, to sell the house and go somewhere else. I said I had thought about it once early on before the fire. He said, "What stopped you?" I said, "The same thing that stopped the Garcias from staying. I didn't want to let her be the reason I moved." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Same reason Maya didn't want to switch soccer teams when that coach was being unfair." I said, "Exactly." He said, "She learned that from somewhere." The month before the plea, I got a letter from a woman I'd never heard of, a resident in a HOA community in San Bernardino County who had read the LA Times piece. She described a situation that was different in its specifics and identical in its architecture. A long-serving board president who had rewritten the bylaws over time, selectively enforced rules, and used the HOA as a mechanism of social and financial control. She asked if I had advice. I sat with the letter for 2 days. Then I called Phil and asked if I could give her his contact information. He said yes. I wrote back to her and gave it to her. 3 other letters came that month in the same vein. I answered them all. I gave Phil's contact where it was appropriate. I gave the county OES's community preparedness resources where that was appropriate. I gave the name of the UC Riverside report that had first identified Pinecrest as a bottleneck, because the study methodology was applicable to other communities. I spent 2 evenings on these letters. It felt like the right use of the documentation I had spent 3 years building. Not just for Pinecrest, for the structure itself. Rosa called me 2 days before the plea was finalized. She had received a letter from the court about the victim impact statements, and she wanted to know if she should submit one. I told her it was completely her choice and that whatever she decided would be right. She said, "I want to, but I don't know how to say it without sounding small." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean, it was the wind chimes. $300. How do I explain that in a document about a criminal trial?" I said, "Rosa, you explain it the same way you explained it to me at my kitchen table. The small things are where the control lives. That's the whole point." She submitted her statement. I don't know exactly what she wrote. That was hers. But she told me afterward that she had written about the night shifts and the $300 and what it had meant to worry about a violation notice while driving home exhausted, and how that worry had been manufactured by one person to keep her in a particular position. She had said all of that in a victim impact statement in a criminal case. And it was in the record, permanent, adjacent to the fire and the gate and the children and the Shell LLC, because it belonged there. Felicia and I had coffee 2 weeks before the end of my board term. She had become someone I respected in a different way than I had at the beginning, not because she had changed, but because I understood her better. She had been afraid in a very specific way that I had not been, because she was inside the structure that was harming people rather than outside it, and the cost of speaking had been different for her. She had spoken anyway at a board meeting in front of 67 people and a news camera. That took a different kind of courage than what I had needed. I told her so. She said, "You make it sound noble." I said, "It was practical. And it was noble. Both things are true." The night before my last board meeting as president, I read through the complete set of HOA bylaws, the current version, which we had revised thoroughly in the first 6 months of the new board's tenure. Every ambiguity that Margaret had used had been clarified. The Emergency Authority Amendment from 2021 had been rescinded and replaced with language that explicitly recognized County Emergency Management Authority. The violation process had independent review. The financial controls were specific and auditable. The document was 68 pages, 6 more than Margaret's version. It was less readable but more honest. I thought about the woman in the Pinecrest sales brochure, the realtor's image of a tight-knit community, and what that phrase had actually meant under Margaret's governance. Tightly knit in the sense that a net is tightly knit. The structure is real, but its purpose is to catch things and hold them. What I had been trying to build, slowly, imperfectly, with 11 other people on 2 committees and a board and a folder that had cost me 3 years, was something different. Tightly knit in the sense of resilient, woven together with enough overlap that if one thread gave, the structure held. I don't want to make this more than it was. A neighborhood HOA is not a city or a country. What happened in Pinecrest was not a revolution. It was a correction, slow, documented, expensive, imperfect, and it worked because the right people had the right resources at the right moment and because one woman overreached one morning in August in a way that made her obstruction visible to people who could act on it. 100 small decisions had led to that morning. Most of them were made in private, at kitchen tables and in courthouse parking lots and on the phone with county officials, with no audience and no applause. That is how the important work gets done. I think about Margaret sometimes. Not often. Not with the kind of sustained intensity one thought about her during those years. Just occasionally, the way you think about a system that failed and what it cost, clinically, architecturally, without anger. She was not stupid. She was not incidentally cruel. She was intelligent and organized and committed, and she had built a very effective structure, and she had used it to harm people in ways they could not easily name or resist. The harm was real. The structure was real. And it was gone. That was sufficient. The last thing I want to tell you from this period, before the final pieces of what happened at the courthouse, is about Maya. On the evening after we heard the plea was coming, before the terms were announced, she asked me, She was 10, going on 40. Mom, what does it mean when someone pleads no contest? I explained it. She thought for a moment. She said, so she didn't say she was wrong. She just said she wouldn't fight anymore. I said, that's a good way to put it. She was quiet. Then she said, is that enough? I thought about it. I said, I don't know, but it'll have to be. She nodded slowly, picked up her rock guide, and went back to reading. That sounded right to me too. The last board meeting I chaired was on a Tuesday evening in January. 22 residents attended, which was about average for the new era. We approved the Emergency Preparedness Committee's annual report, discussed a proposal for an additional fire hydrant connection near the Eastern Gate, and voted on a community compost pilot program that Rosa had proposed. The compost program passed 4-1. Howard voted against on grounds of pest management concerns, and we debated it respectfully for 12 minutes before voting. It was the most ordinary meeting of my life, and I was grateful for every minute of it. When the meeting ended, I collected the agenda binders and the recording secretary's notes and the board materials and put them in the HOA cabinet, which was now organized with labeled folders that anyone on the board could access. I gave my key to Angela, the new board president-elect, who was standing by the door with her coat on and her own folder under her arm. She said, "You're leaving a really solid system." I said, "Make it yours. Better than mine." She said, "I'll try." She would. I was sure of that. I turned off the lights in the community room. I stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the parking lot sounds outside, car doors, a conversation, a dog barking once at something. The room smelled like old coffee and copy paper and years of meetings held in fluorescent light. I thought about Margaret in this room, 11 years of gavels and color charts and motions she had written herself. Then I opened the door and went home. The sentencing hearing was a formality after the plea. No prison time, the suspended sentences concurrent, the terms read and acknowledged. I had not attended the plea entry, and I did not attend sentencing either. Phil called me afterward and read me the final terms from the court record. I wrote them down. Then I put the pen down and said, "Thank you, Phil, for all of it." He said, "You did the work." I said, "We both did." He said, "Yes, that's true. That was sufficient." Sandra Reyes sent me a copy of the Pinecrest case study, as it came to be called in the state OES materials, a 3-page summary of the incident and its resolution, used in county emergency management training. My name appeared once, as a community member who facilitated county emergency access. That was all. That was right. I was not the story. The gate opening was the story. The children getting home was the story. I was just the person who had stood at a particular intersection of knowledge, documentation, and willingness at a specific moment in time. In the spring, 2 years after the fire, I took Maya hiking on the county fire road that runs east of Pinecrest, the same road the evacuation bus had used when it drove through our gate on that August morning. The chaparral on the ridge was full and green, the way it gets in a wet spring. Maya collected 7 rocks she hadn't seen before. I showed her the point where the fire had stopped. You could still see the line on the hillside if you knew what to look for, older gray scrub on one side, younger growth on the other. She looked at it for a while. She said, "That's where it stopped?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Because of the road?" I said, "Partly because of the road, and partly because of the people who drove on it to fight the fire, and partly because of everything that made the road accessible." She thought about that. She said, "A lot of things had to work." I said, "Yes, that's usually how it is." The eastern gate was open when we came back through it that afternoon. A county fire district truck was parked near it. They were doing a routine maintenance check on the access road. The driver was a young firefighter who waved at us. I waved back. Maya said, "Do you know him?" I said no. She said, "He looked like he knew you." I said maybe he had been briefed on the access history, or maybe he had seen the news, or maybe I just had the face of someone who had once done something involving this gate. She shrugged and went back to her rocks. The gate was open. The road was clear. The fire season was coming. We were ready. I put the folder in the fireproof box that night, the complete folder, and I did not add anything to it for the first time in 3 years. I sat at the dining table. No papers spread out, no phone calls pending, and I looked at the room. The same table. Maya's soccer cleats by the door, Daniel's grating on the counter. The small collection of rocks Maya had arranged on the windowsill in some order only she fully understood. Ordinary. Intact. Ours. I had worked very hard for that particular ordinary. I did not take it for granted, and I did not make it more than it was. I just let it be what it was. I am going to tell you what actually happened at the gate. Not the summary I gave earlier, not the shape of it, the actual sequence of 7 minutes between my car door opening and the National Guard arriving. Because there are things I glossed over, things that hurt to tell, and this is the part that needs to be told completely. When I got out of my car and walked toward Margaret at the gate, I was running on adrenaline and 3 years of documentation and exactly the kind of cold clarity that comes when the thing you've been afraid might happen has happened and is actually finally in front of you. I had called Sandra. I had sent the texts. I had my phone recording. I was ready in every practical sense. I was not ready for what I felt when I saw the children's faces through the bus windows. There was a boy in the 3rd row who was maybe 6 years old, pressing his palm flat against the glass. Not waving, not reaching, just pressing his hand there, the way children do when they want contact and don't know how to ask for it. His face was turned sideways, watching the smoke. I saw him and something happened to my chest that had nothing to do with documentation or easement records or county emergency protocol. I had to look away. I looked at Margaret instead. That was easier. Margaret said, "This is private HOA property." And I said the words I said, and she said the words she said, and underneath all of it I was thinking, 23 children. Marcus, the bus driver, shaking. Maya 300 meters back in our car, safe, because we had gotten out before the gate was blocked. And this woman, in a silk robe, with a padlock she had chosen to hold. What I have not told you, what I did not fully understand until later, was that Margaret had driven to that gate before I arrived. She had left her house at 6:09 a.m., before most residents were awake, before the evacuation order had been widely received on personal phones. She had gone to the gate and padlocked it, and then she had gone back to her house for her robe, and then she had come back and positioned herself. I know this because Todd told the investigators that she had asked him the evening before the fire, the night the red flag warning was issued, to bring the eastern gate key to her house. He had done it. He had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought about it later. He would think about it for a long time. She had premeditated it. She had watched the weather forecast and she had retrieved the gate key and she had gone, in the early hours of a wildfire morning, to lock a gate that was the fastest path out of the neighborhood for 23 children. She had done it with full awareness of what the gate was, what the fire was, and what her lock meant. The DA's case rested on this. So did everything else. So did the shape of the woman I had spent 3 years watching from the front row of HOA meetings. When Officer Castillo arrived and Margaret produced the Finch memo from her pocket, I understood for the first time the full architecture of what she had built. The memo was not a legal document. It was a prop. It was designed to create enough procedural confusion that anyone responding to the scene would hesitate long enough for her to maintain her position. She had prepared it. She had carried it in her pocket to a fire evacuation. She had thought this through. The audacity of it, the detailed, premeditated audacity, made me briefly unable to speak, which was fortunate because I was supposed to be quiet. Marcus, the bus driver, stood next to me for a portion of those 47 minutes, and I want to tell you what he was like, because he has been a footnote in my account and he should not be. He was 43, he had been driving school buses for 11 years, he was a father of 3. When he got out of the bus and stood with me, he had made a decision not to use the northern route, which would have been the path of least resistance and which no one would have blamed him for, because he knew the route comparison. He had looked at the fire behavior forecast on his phone, and he had decided his children were not going on the unsafe route because a woman in a silk robe was blocking the other one. He stood there for 47 minutes. He held the line. At one point during the wait, while Margaret was on the phone with Gerald Finch, Marcus leaned toward me and said quietly, "Is this going to work?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You sure?" I said, "Yes." I was not entirely sure. But the alternative to saying yes was saying no, and the alternative to that was Marcus putting those 23 children on the northern route, and I was not going to allow that while I still had a phone and a county OES contact and 3 years of documentation in a fireproof box. I said yes. He nodded and did not move. The smoke column was clearly visible from the gate by 7 a.m. The sky behind it had turned a specific orange-gray that anyone who has lived in Southern California fire country knows. The color that means it is real and it is close. Several of the children on the bus had seen it. A girl in the back had her face buried in her hoodie. I saw this from where I stood. I did not let myself feel it because I needed to be functional. I filed it away to feel later. I felt it later. I am feeling it now, writing this down. Margaret did not look at the bus during those 47 minutes. Not once. She looked at Officer Castillo, at me, at the gathered residents, at her phone. She looked at the gate, occasionally, to confirm the lock was still there. She did not look at the 23 faces pressed against the windows of the school bus. I do not know whether this was because she had found a way not to see them, or because she saw them and it did not change her calculation. I don't know which of those is worse. When Sergeant Morales arrived and produced the easement document on his tablet and Margaret looked at it, that moment when she finally looked at the document, she had always known existed, held by a person she could not dismiss. I watched her face with the full attention I had been giving her face for 3 years. She read it. Her eyes moved across the screen. She reached the end. She looked up. For 1 second, maybe less, there was nothing behind her expression. No calculation, no performance, no confidence. Just a woman who had built an elaborate structure and was watching it hold its shape for the last moment before it was dismantled. She said the sentence about wanting it on record that she was complying under protest. She held out the key. The soldier took it. The gate opened. Marcus was back in his driver's seat. The bus rolled through. I watched it go. I watched until it turned onto the county fire road and was no longer visible from where I stood. Then I turned back to the clearing, where Officer Castillo and Sergeant Morales were finishing their documentation and the residents were beginning to move toward their cars, and Margaret was standing very still, and the camera was rolling and the smoke was thicker. I looked at the key in Sergeant Morales's hand. It was a small brass key, unremarkable, the kind you can get copied at a hardware store for $2. This was the key Margaret had asked Todd to bring to her house the night before. This was the key that had locked the gate at 6:09 a.m. This was the key that had held 23 children in a school bus for 47 minutes while fire moved down a ridge a mile away. Sergeant Morales had placed it in an evidence bag. I do not know what happened to it after that. I know it will not lock that gate again. After the bus went through and the residents began to evacuate, a few people stopped to say something to me. Rosa touched my arm. Earl nodded. Jeff Hartman shook my hand without saying anything, which was the right call. Gary Park, who had arrived late in his truck with his wife and his son, stopped beside me on his way through the gate. He looked at me for a moment. His son, 7 years old, in a soccer jersey, was in the back seat. Gary said, "Thank you." I said, "Please go." He went. I was the last civilian through the gate. I drove through it slowly, deliberately, looked in my rearview mirror once at the road behind me, and then drove toward the County Fire Road where Daniel and Maya were waiting in our car 3 intersections away. Maya ran to the driver's door when I pulled up. She said, "Mom, you took forever." I said, "I know. I'm sorry. Is everyone okay?" Daniel said yes. Maya said, "There's a lot of smoke." I said, "I know. Get in." We drove away. I did not look back again. What happened after we cleared the gate and got onto the northbound highway, the wide, clear road that would take us to the Hotel 3 Counties over where we would stay for 3 days during the evacuation, was that I began to shake. Not dramatically. My hands on the steering wheel were trembling slightly. Daniel noticed. He put his hand on mine. He didn't say anything. Maya, in the back seat, had fallen asleep within 5 minutes, her rock collection bag clutched to her chest. I drove for 40 minutes before the trembling stopped. Then I called Sandra Reyes as I'd said I would. Sandra said the county fire department had used the eastern access road within 2 hours of the gate opening. The backfire line they'd run had held. The 4 Cascade Holdings properties on the eastern edge had minor smoke damage but were structurally intact. 11 homes in Pinecrest had sustained roof-level embers damage. All were reparable. There had been no deaths, no serious injuries in the community. 13 pet cats had been reported missing in the evacuation. 9 had been found. Sandra read me these numbers in her professional voice, and I listened to all of them and I said, "Thank you." She said, "Thank you, Ms. Nguyen." Then we hung up. I am not a crier in the ordinary run of things. I had cried once, that night in the driveway after the election, for 5 minutes, and then not again until this. On the highway, the evacuation behind us, Daniel's hand on mine, Maya asleep, Sandra's voice in my head saying no deaths, no injuries. When I let myself feel the 47 minutes at the gate in full, I put on the turn signal for a rest stop and pulled off the highway and sat in the parking lot and wept for about 3 minutes. Then I got back on the highway. Daniel had not said a word. He was exactly right about that. In the hotel that night, Daniel ordered pizza and we ate it on the bed watching a nature documentary about penguins because Maya had chosen it and it was perfect. I held my phone in my hand and looked at the texts from Sandra, from Phil, from Earl, from Rosa, from 3 neighbors I had barely spoken to before that morning, all variations of safe, okay, thank you. I put the phone down. I watched penguins. Maya fell asleep between us. I lay awake until about 2 a.m., not thinking about anything in particular. Just being awake in a room that wasn't on fire.
Cao trào, lộ diện và trừng phạt.
The hearing where Margaret formally entered her plea was, as I said, one I did not attend. But I want to tell you what Felicia told me about it because Felicia watched it for all of us. She sat in the 3rd row on the aisle, and she said the courtroom was small and official and smelled like recirculated air, and that Margaret walked in with Robert Choi, her final attorney, and sat at the defense table and opened a notepad and wrote something on the first line that Felicia couldn't see. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Wu. She read the charges and the plea terms into the record with precision and no drama. Margaret listened with her hands folded on the table. When the judge asked her to state her plea, she said no contest in a voice that Felicia described as entirely composed. The same voice Margaret used to call a meeting to order. The judge acknowledged the plea and asked Margaret if she understood the terms of the agreement. Margaret said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge said, "Very well." That was it. The charges read into the record that morning were the summary of 3 years of folders and $14 courthouse trips and county OES calls and fire season documents and Felicia's phone. Recording and Todd's testimony and Gerald Finch's late cooperation and Phil's brief and the county easement dated 1998 and 23 children on a bus and a small brass key in an evidence bag. All of that had contracted in the way that legal processes contract things, to a courtroom and a notepad and 2 words. No contest. Felicia said that when it was over and people were filing out, Margaret sat at the defense table for a moment longer than she needed to. Not dramatically, not visibly emotional, just sitting. Then she put the notepad in her bag, stood, and walked out with Choi. Felicia was watching her face. She said, Margaret looked like a woman who had finished something, not like someone who had been defeated, like someone who had come to the end of something she had long since accepted was ending. Felicia didn't know what to make of that. Neither did I entirely. I think about it still. The terms of the plea went on public record that same day. By evening, the Los Angeles Times had a brief news item, and Carolyn Marsh sent me a text. Court filing is public. I'll write something short. You okay? I said yes. She said, You sure? I said yes. She wrote a 7-paragraph piece that was accurate and precise and did not editorialize. She quoted the court record. She named the charges and the penalties. She wrote one sentence about the Eastern Gate and the 23 children. That was enough. That was the right amount. The Riverside County Fire District held a small recognition event 2 months after the plea for the personnel who had worked the Pinecrest fire and access incident. I was invited by Sandra, who was there via video from Sacramento. Sergeant Morales was there in person. Officer Castillo was there. Marcus, the bus driver, was there. He had driven up from Riverside in his personal car on a Saturday. They gave out pins and certificates. There were sandwiches. I spoke briefly and thanked the people in the room and did not mention myself. Marcus found me afterward by the coffee and said, I still think about that morning. I said, Me too. He said, In a good way now. I said, Yes, in a good way now. The permanent bar from HOA directorship was, in the context of the criminal justice outcomes, a minor detail. Misdemeanor conviction, felony conviction, suspended sentences, probation, restitution. The bar was attached to the misdemeanor, almost as an afterthought, a professional consequence attached to a charge about blocking a gate. But it was the one that mattered most to the 142 households of Pinecrest Estates, and to every other neighborhood in California where someone like Margaret Holloway had been or was building her structure. She could not do it again. Not here, not anywhere in the state. That was the lock that actually mattered. Todd called me from Portland in January, 3 months after the plea. He was working at a nonprofit there, something with community land trusts, he said, which I thought was appropriate. He sounded different, not resolved exactly, but less compressed. He asked how the neighborhood was. I told him about the new board, the compost program, the emergency preparedness committee. He laughed a little at the compost program, which was the right reaction. He said, I hope you know I'm sorry. I said, I know. You showed it where it counted. He said, It wasn't enough early on. I said, It was enough when it was needed. That's what matters. I meant that. Gerald Finch, I learned from Phil, had retired from his HOA legal practice. He was doing estate planning and real estate closings now, quieter, more transactional work, further from the particular kind of harm he had helped facilitate. Phil did not say this with satisfaction. Neither did I. Finch had been a tool in Margaret's architecture, poorly used and willing to be. He had eventually told the truth. I didn't know what to feel about Gerald Finch, and I decided not to decide. Some things don't require a verdict from me. The Cascade Holdings properties that Rosa and Gary bought were, by the following spring, genuinely lived in. Rosa's herb garden had expanded into a kitchen garden with tomatoes, chiles, and something I didn't recognize that turned out to be episode. Gary had put a basketball hoop in his driveway, and on Saturday afternoons there were usually 4 or 5 kids from the block using it, including, regularly, Maya. I walked past it on my way to the trail sometimes. I never stopped to catalog it or document it. I just walked past and let it be what it was. The news cycle moved on as news cycles do. By the spring after the plea, Pinecrest was no longer a story anyone was following. The LA Times had moved to other HOA cases. There was no shortage. The state bill was working its way through committee. The OES case study was being used in training. The neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do when the pressure lifts. It was simply living. Block parties, dog walks, driveway conversations about nothing in particular. The community listserv, which had once been Margaret's instrument, was now mostly used to share photos of a family of foxes that had taken up residence near the Eastern Gate. I received an email from a law professor at UCLA the summer after the plea. She was writing a chapter on HOA governance and liability and wanted to cite the Pinecrest case. She asked if she would be willing to review her characterization of events for accuracy. I said yes. I read her chapter draft carefully and sent back 14 corrections, all factual. She incorporated them and sent me the revised version. The chapter described the case as an example of how layered documentation, community organizing, and timely governmental intervention can successfully counteract entrenched misuse of HOA authority. I thought that was accurate. I told her so. Phil and I had lunch in the fall of the second year. He ordered a burger and I ordered a salad and he said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "If you had known in the beginning, when you got the first violation notice about the mailbox, what it was going to take to get here, would you have done it?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know." He said, "That's the honest answer." I said, "What would you have done?" He thought, "I'd have done it. But I'm a litigator. It's different." I said, "It's not that different." He said, "No, I suppose not. What I know 2 years out is this: it is not required to be extraordinary to do the necessary work. I am a civil engineer with good organizational habits and a functional knowledge of public records. I am not a lawyer, not a politician, not a community organizer by training. I am a person who grew up watching her mother keep a shoebox of receipts and who learned early that the difference between being hurt by a system and surviving it is usually documentation. I applied what I knew. I asked for help from people who knew more. I did not quit. That is not extraordinary. That is just the minimum. But I want to be honest. The minimum is hard. It is expensive and time-consuming and lonely in specific ways, and it costs you things you don't fully account for until they're gone. I lost a year of weekends. I had conversations with my daughter that a 9-year-old should not have needed to have. I spent savings I had set aside for other things. I was angry for a sustained period in a way that was useful and also corrosive. I kept the anger calibrated, neither too high to be functional nor too low to sustain the work. That calibration cost me something. I don't regret it, but I want to name it. I want to say something about the residents who didn't act, the ones who had seen what Margaret was doing for years, who had paid fines they knew were arbitrary, who had changed plans and bitten tongues and sold houses and moved away. I do not judge them. I had resources they didn't: time, professional skills, the particular knowledge that comes from having watched someone use a system against your family before. I had Phil. I had Sandra. I had the kind of job that allowed me flexibility and the kind of marriage that held steady under pressure. Those are not virtues. Those are circumstances. Most people doing the minimum, just surviving, are doing more than I did. Pinecrest held its first community-wide emergency drill in the spring of the third year after the fire. 41 households participated. The drill included an evacuation route walkthrough, a go-bag checklist, and a demonstration of the new gate key protocol. The county fire district sent a liaison. It was a Saturday morning in March, chilly and clear, and people came in their jackets with their children and their dogs, and they walked the route together, and it was, in its way, the most effective thing the HOA had ever organized. Margaret's name was not mentioned. It did not need to be. I walked the route with Maya and Daniel. We went through the eastern gate, down the county fire road to the first intersection, and back. Maya had her rock bag. She found a piece of jasper on the fire road that she was very pleased about. Daniel and I walked behind her and ahead of a group of neighbors, and the air was clear and the ridge was green and the open gate was just a gate. A piece of iron on hinges, accessible to anyone, key held by people with a professional and legal obligation to open it. Ordinary, right? Ours. 6 months after the drill, I was asked by the new HOA board to help review the governing documents one more time. Not because something was wrong, because a new family had moved in and found a small ambiguity in the landscaping approval section and wanted to understand it. I read the section. It was genuinely ambiguous. We had missed it in the revision. I noted it, drafted a clarification, and sent it to the board with a recommendation. They approved it at the next meeting. This is what governance looks like when it's working. Small, practical, unspectacular corrections made by people who are paying attention. The new family's name was the Nguyen's. No relation. They had 2 kids, a boy, 7, and a girl, 5, and a golden doodle named Biscuit. They had moved from Sacramento. They had done their due diligence on the HOA before buying, which their realtor had told them to do because HOA abuses had been in the news. They had read the financial audit summary and the revised bylaws and the county compliance certificate, and they had decided the neighborhood was safe. I met them at the fall block party. They were warm and ordinary and entirely themselves. I thought, this is who the work was for. People who don't know what it took because they don't need to.
Cao trào bùng nổ tiếp nối.
I should tell you what happened to Margaret's house. She listed it in February of the 2nd year. It sold in 6 weeks. Pinecrest property values had, counterintuitively, risen after the national press coverage, because people associated the neighborhood with the successful response rather than the obstruction. The buyers were a couple in their 40s who had 2 labs and a vegetable garden plan. They stripped the interior down and renovated entirely. The pearl white Escalade had been gone before the house listed. I drove past the house once the week after it sold, on my way to the trail. There was a moving truck in the driveway and 2 men carrying a couch through the front door. The rose bushes Margaret had planted near the walkway were still there. She had apparently left them, or the buyers had kept them. They were well-established, healthy, probably the best-maintained thing on the exterior of any house on the block. I thought about that for a moment. She had taken very good care of the roses. I drove on. The roses are still there. I walk past them on the way to the trail sometimes. They bloom in April and again in October. The new owners apparently don't know their history or don't care, which is fine. The roses are just roses. They're not complicit. Things that are well-tended don't need to carry the meaning of who tended them. I am writing the end of this now, and I want to be precise about what the end means. It does not mean resolution in the sense of everything being repaired. The Garcias are still in their new city, and whatever it cost them to leave will always have cost them that. The $300 Rosa paid in an unjust fine was returned in the settlement, but the nights she spent worrying about it while driving home from the hospital, those were not returned because they cannot be. Gary Park's son was safe on the bus, and Gary's son does not know and will not remember what nearly happened, which is right and good, but Gary knows. Gary will always know. The harm that Margaret Holloway did to the community of Pinecrest Estates over 11 years was not undone by the legal process or the election or the new bylaws or the community drills. It was interrupted. That is different. The interruption was necessary and consequential and real. But the things that were broken, and the people who were hurt, and accountability is not the same as repair. I want to be honest about that. What accountability is in this story and in others like it is a record. A true record entered in official documents that says, this happened, this person did it, these were the consequences. The record is public. It is permanent or as permanent as records are. It means that the next person who runs a search on Margaret Holloway before hiring her as a community manager or a board advisor or a property trustee will find it. It means the pattern is documented. It means the structure she built is visible in retrospect, and visibility is the beginning of prevention. Sergeant Morales was reassigned to a base in San Diego 6 months after the Pinecrest activation. I exchanged one email with him. I thanked him. He said it was his job, and that the community had done good work to get the right people there at the right time. He signed it, "Take care." I wrote back, "Take care." That was our whole correspondence. It was complete. Officer Castillo was promoted. I read it in the county sheriff's bulletin that Phil forwarded me. Not about her specifically, but about the department's community liaison program, and her name was in the list of the new senior liaison officers. She had been thorough and calm at the gate, and she had been put in a situation that exceeded her immediate authorization, and she had handled it correctly. She had stayed, she had called for backup, she had not backed down. That was what was needed. She got there. Marcus, the school bus driver, was recognized by the Riverside Unified School District for his conduct during the evacuation. The recognition was a certificate and a mention at a school board meeting, which he sent me a photo of. He looked embarrassed and pleased in the photo, the way people do when they are recognized for something they considered doing their job. I sent him back, "You did your job and then some. Congratulations." He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a bus emoji. That was right. Earl Simmons planted a defensible space garden around his house the spring after the fire, with guidance from the county fire district. It was full of succulents and low-water natives and a specific ground cover that was fire-resistant. He sent me a photo of it in June from his own phone, which he had figured out how to use properly in the intervening months. He said it was ugly but strategic. I sent back, "That's the best kind." He replied, "Don't tell my wife." 2.5 years after the fire, on a Tuesday in October, I received a package in the mail from a return address I did not recognize in Pasadena. Inside was a small object wrapped in tissue paper and a handwritten note on cream stationery. The object was a brass key, small, ordinary, the kind you can copy at a hardware store for $2. The note said, in Margaret Holloway's handwriting, "I know you kept records. I want you to know I kept one too. Nothing else." No signature, though the handwriting was unmistakable. No explanation. I held the key in my palm for a long time. I thought about what it meant. The key was not the original gate key. That was in a county evidence bag somewhere. This was, I assumed, a copy. I thought about why she had sent it. I thought about the woman who had stood at the gate in her silk robe and held the line for 47 minutes and then finally placed the key in a soldier's hand. I thought about the 4 words she had said as she did it, "I am complying under protest." I thought about a woman who had built 11 years of a community and believed, somewhere inside the architecture of her certainty, that she was protecting it. I do not believe she was innocent of the things she did. The documentation is clear. The record is complete. I do not feel sympathy where the children on the bus are concerned, or the families who left in distress, or Rose's $300 and the nights of worry. I am clear about all of that, but I have thought about what it must have been to be Margaret Holloway, to have built a structure and believed in it and defended it and then watched the documentation pile up against her and the gate open anyway and the record become permanent. I have thought about what it costs to be wrong at that scale and at that age and never, fully, to say so. I thought about it holding a small brass key in a parking lot in October. I put the key in the fireproof box with the folder and the court documents and the settlement records and the county easement and Sandra's text and the photo of Earl with the framed picture at his party. I closed the box. I left the room. I went to make dinner, which was pasta, ordinary pasta, because it was a Tuesday. Daniel was at the table grading papers. Maya was at the counter doing homework. her rock collection arranged in a semicircle near her notebook in the order only she understood. The house smelled like olive oil and garlic. I put the pot on. I was home. This is what I want to tell you, at the end of this long account of a thing that happened in a neighborhood in Southern California over 3 years and one August morning. It mattered that I kept the folder. It mattered that I knew about easements. It mattered that Sandra Reyes picked up the phone. It mattered that Earl Simmons brought a folding chair. It mattered that Marcus didn't move. It mattered that 23 children got home safe. All of those things mattered, and they were all part of the same structure, and the structure held. That is enough. That is, in the end, everything. The eastern gate of Pinecrest Estates is unlocked every morning at 7 a.m. by the HOA grounds crew and relocked at 9 p.m. unless there is a red flag warning or an active emergency, in which case it stays open and the county fire district is automatically notified. The protocol is in the revised bylaws, Section 8, Subsection C. The original county easement document is framed and mounted in the HOA community room, next to the door at eye level. Below it is a small plaque. The plaque reads, Pinecrest Estates Eastern Emergency Access Gate. County Easement RC 1998-044. For the safety of all. I put the plaque there. The new board approved it unanimously. Jeff Hartman suggested the exact wording. Earl said, keep it simple. Rosa said, good. Maya came with me the day we installed it. She held the drill for a minute while I read the instructions, then handed it back. She read the plaque when it was up, lips moving slightly. She said, it doesn't say anything about what happened. I said, no. She said, is that okay? I thought about it. I said, the gate being open says it. She looked at the gate. It was open. She nodded. We went home. I have been asked in the time since all of this whether I feel like a hero. I do not. I feel like a civil engineer who kept good records and made the right phone calls at the right time, and who was lucky enough to be in a position, professional, financial, personal, where doing so was possible. I feel like the person who had the shoebox her mother kept, upgraded to a fireproof box and a county OES contact. That is what I feel like. That is what I am. I feel like the mother of a child who came home safe from school. I feel like the neighbor of families who deserved better than 11 years of Margaret Holloway. I feel like the engineer who looks at the eastern gate every time she drives past it. Open, ordinary, compliant with its original purpose, and thinks, that is how it should have always been. That is the structure working. I did not build it. I did not build it alone. I just helped keep it from being dismantled. That is sufficient. That is more than enough. The fire season comes every year. The ridge east of Pinecrest grows its chaparral and dries in the August heat, and the red flag warnings come in their turn. The first time I heard the code red alert on my phone after the fire, a different fire, a different county, 2 years later, I sat up very fast from sleep and my hands were already moving. Phone, records, key. Daniel put his hand on my arm. He said, it's not here. I lay back down. The alert faded. I breathed. The gate was open. The road was clear. We were ready. We are always ready now. Maya is 12 now. She has her rock collection, which has grown to require 2 shelves, organized by mineral composition, and 1 additional shelf she calls emotional category, which is her system and which I have never questioned. She asked me recently if she could read this account when I finished it. I said yes. She said, all of it. I said all of it. She said, even the part where you cried in the parking lot? I said yes. She said, good. People should know that part. I agreed. People should know that part. I have been asked what advice I would give to someone in a situation like mine, in a community where someone is using governance as a weapon. I have given this a great deal of thought, and I have 3 things to say. First, Document everything from the first violation notice, with dates and exact wording. You cannot imagine what you will need later, and you cannot retrieve what you did not save. Second, find the original documents, the easements, the county records, the founding instruments, because the original structure usually tells you what has been altered and why. Third, find one other person who sees what you see and trust them. You cannot do it alone. No one can. Earl Simmons, sitting in his truck with his folding chair, was the most important phone call I ever made. The last time I walked through the eastern gate on the County Fire Road, I stopped for a moment in the place where the backfire line had held, where the older chaparral ended and the newer growth began, the boundary that 2 years of weather had softened but not erased. I put my hand on a branch of young ceanothus, blue-flowering, new growth soft. This was what had grown in the space where fire had stopped and turned back. Not a monument, not a memorial, just a plant growing in the direction of the light, in the space that had been cleared for it. I let go of the branch. I walked back through the gate. I went home. 3 years, 1 month, and 4 days after the first violation notice about our mailbox post, the notice about the beige paint that was allegedly 3 shades off specification. I received a letter from the California Department of Consumer Affairs confirming the permanent revocation of Margaret Holloway's HOA directorship eligibility. The letter was 1 page, standard format, no commentary, just the fact, the date, and the official seal. I read it once, placed it in the fireproof box on top of the small brass key, and closed the lid. I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter and more durable, the satisfaction of a structure that holds. That is enough. That is everything. The neighborhood held its annual fall block party 3 weeks after the directorship revocation letter arrived. There were kids on the street, dogs on leashes, a folding table with chili and cornbread and Rose's tres leches cake that was, again, the best thing anyone had eaten all year. Jeff Hartman ran a quiz about local fire safety that was harder than it needed to be and that everyone loved. Earl won it, which surprised no one. The sky was clear. The ridge was visible to the east, green and quiet. Nobody mentioned Margaret. Nobody needed to. I helped clean up after the party, stacking chairs and folding tables with a group of neighbors I now knew by name. Angela, the new board president. Don, the architect on the landscaping committee. The Toongwins, the new family who stayed to help without being asked. Gary Park and his son, who was in a soccer jersey again and who helped carry a cooler with focused 9-year-old determination. Rosa, who packed the last of the tres leches into a container and pressed it on me to take home. Maya, who had been talking to someone's grandmother about rocks for 40 minutes and was entirely satisfied with this. I carried a folding table back to the storage room in the community room. I set it against the wall next to the others. I looked at the plaque by the door, the county easement plaque. I looked at the framed document beside it. I looked at the door which led out to Sycamore Lane, which led to the eastern gate, which was open. I thought, this is a building in a neighborhood in Riverside County, California, and it is administered by a volunteer board that meets once a month and argues about compost and landscaping approvals and the correct height for fence posts. And all of that is exactly right. All of that is the structure working. I turned off the light and went home. That night, after Maya was in bed and Daniel was reading, I sat on the front step for a while in the October dark. The air was cool and smelled like eucalyptus and distant ocean. A neighbor's cat crossed the street in front of me and disappeared under a car. A light was on in Rose's house 3 doors down. Another light in the Noongwins' living room. Earl's porch light, always on after dark, safety habit of the firefighter retired. The street was quiet and full of people the way streets are supposed to be. I sat until I was cold. Then I went inside. In the morning I would check the HOA email, review a minor permit request, and call the county fire district to confirm the spring equipment test for the gate access protocol. In the afternoon, I would pick Maya up from school, and she would show me a piece of feldspar she'd found on the playground. In the evening, Daniel would make soup, and we would sit at the table, the three of us, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. The folder was in the fireproof box. The gate was open. The road was clear. Maya asked me once. She was 11, and it was an ordinary Tuesday, and we were driving home from school. "Mom, are you glad we stayed?" I thought about the Garcias who had left. I thought about Rosa's house with the terracotta paint and the herb garden. I thought about Earl and his fire-resistant landscaping and his framed photo. I thought about the girl in the pink backpack, standing at the top of the bus stairs, whose name I never learned. I thought about the folder. I thought about the gate, open in the morning light. I said, "Yes, Maya, I'm glad we stayed." She looked out the window. She said, "Me too." The END.